What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I am your host for today, Simon Villanoz, aka Coach V. This is episode 374, recorded on June 21st, 2024, and here we go. We got a new season of football coming up in Colorado this fall. You know, there's going to be some really good changes. First things first, girls flag football, now an official sport sanctioned by CHSAA just a couple months ago, so we will be covering that in full. We have been the last 2 years, in case you haven't been paying attention, but officially we'll be covering that, so we're all super excited, currently doing research for that season. But obviously we have boys football as well, and some realignment, a lot of teams moving up and down here, which will, you know, have some different looks and games and matchups this season as a result. And so, per usual, before every Colorado high school football season, we here on Playmakers Corner, we're going to talk about every single 11-man football team before the season starts, so that you, the listeners, may be ready and know what to expect. We're going to cover all 200 plus 11-man football teams 1 through 5A in the state. We are the only media to do that, and we've been doing it for a couple years now as well, and so we're super excited for this season. And we're also going to start having episodes Monday, Wednesday, Friday for these previews. And if you're new here and you don't know what these previews consist of, I'll keep it pretty simple here. We're going to talk about each and every team, what happened last year, so recaps. We also made predictions on the record, so we'll talk about that as well. Stay accountable over here. You know, talk about graduating seniors / departures. That could include coaches and transfers, key players going into this season, and then ultimately we are going to predict the record of every single team here before the season starts. And we'll also give them a window of wins, aka WOW here, which is basically the range of wins we expect teams to kind of fall within, which, like I said, you know, humble brag, we've been pretty good about as the season goes on. Now, not perfect, you know, we work with the information we have, and, you know, it's really hard to just exactly predict, you know, 200 plus seasons, but, you know, we do our best here on the Playmakers Corner podcast. And so on this episode, we have a number of teams. We're going to go ahead and start in Colorado Springs here, and these are all 4A teams, all right? So all 4A Colorado Springs teams, plus Montrose. Montrose is kind of just the odd one out, so they will be here on this episode, and we'll talk about them actually at the end. So if you want to skip to the end to Montrose's or anybody's, you know, we have timestamps below. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into it and talk about these great teams from the Springs here on the 4A level. All right, now let's go ahead and start with my alma mater, or one of my alma maters here in Doherty High School here. Last season, they won 5-5. That's exactly what I predicted them to go, 5-5. So that's a record that I got exactly right there, and had a solid season. There were a couple matchups I was wrong about, I will admit that. I was predicting their season and whatnot last year, but I think the only matchups, I mean, there were only 2 that I was wrong about. But the only matchups that I was wrong about was that they lost to Rampart 28-18. That was kind of a tough one, not gonna lie. I felt like, I mean, I didn't get to watch it, but I had someone watching it for me on stream and giving me updates. That was a pretty close game throughout, so that's just a tough one to drop. And then Overland, they would beat Overland. I originally thought that was a team they would lose to, but at the time I didn't know about their transfers, and if I did, I probably would have given them that dub. And so those 2 games evened out. Other than that, rest of the season went as predicted. Lost to Castleview 38-3, beat Coronado 56-14, which I was at, and that was just not close. Then lost to Mesa Ridge 28-0, lost to FFC Fountain Fort Carson 42-0, beat Mountain Range 33-10. Only lost to Denver East 21-0, which is not that bad considering that was a pretty solid squad. Beat Westminster in kind of a crazy one, 70-34. I wouldn't exactly say it was a shootout, but I mean, it is a shootout, combined for 104 points. But I mean, didn't look like it was super close though. Then they beat North Glen 49-12, and like I said, Overland 44-20 to go a solid 5-5, and would just barely miss out on the playoffs here. I think if they won their league, they would have definitely made it. So that Denver East loss was definitely a tough one, as they finished second in 5A here, and second in not second in 5A, but second in their league, in their 5A league. So there you go. There, just missing out on the playoffs. Now, they do graduate a pretty good amount of seniors, starting with Solomon Latimer. He was an all-PMC receiver for us, I think 2 years in a row, as well as a top 5 senior wide receiver for us. Make sure you check out those episodes. But last year, he had 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns, kind of being the main focal point of this offense here. The last 2 years, really, he's had excellent seasons. I'd also say 3 years. Sophomore year wasn't that bad, but these last couple years, he's been super productive on 71 receptions, mind you, as well. And, he's the real deal, and he was a big reason why this offense was so explosive at times, why they were able to score 70 in one game. So there you go there. On top of that, you got to give credit to his number 2 receiver, Logan Hutchin, as well. Probably the best number 2 receiver, senior receiver in the state. Him and Latimer were great, but Logan Hutchin, he had 51 receptions for 1,051 yards and 7 touchdowns. If Latimer wasn't getting the ball, it was Hutchin, right? And both were great playmakers there. At running back, you had a good reliable back, I would say here, in Brian Valdez, who rushed for 826 yards and 12 touchdowns. He was also the top tackler on this team as well, their lead not their lead tackler. He was one of their top tacklers, as in like a top 10 tackler for them. He had 50 on that side of the ball, so a pretty solid two-way athlete. They also lose Micah Jacobs, who was technically their lead tackler. He only played 4 games, though, or listed in playing 4 games, which is tough, but he had 63 tackles, averaging 14 tackles a game, and, that's just a tough one to lose here. He was due for a big season, and it looks like it just got cut short and did not quite work out for him. So there you go. That's a tough loss. They also lose Jay Sean Cooper, who was their starting guard in DT, was their second leading tackler with about 60. He'll be missed. Hayden D. Miller, he was a 6'3", 310-pound lineman for them, offense and defense, who will be gone. Marcus Chacon, he had 8 interceptions and 4 forced fumbles, as an absolute force on that side of the defense. Just a turnover machine, but in a good way, leading in both interceptions and forced fumbles. So that's a tough enforcer to lose. But altogether, the damage looks like this. They'll be graduating 6 of their top 13 tacklers on defense, which does include 3 of their top 5, so there is some leadership to be lost there. And then on offense, you lose some offensive linemen, as well as some pretty key skill players in your top rusher and your top 2 receivers, which is a lot of the offense from last year. But let's talk about this year, and let's talk about the players that will be contributing to this season. And let's start with the incoming junior quarterback, Leland Frescaz, the 6'3", 200-pound quarterback, threw for 2,398 yards, 21 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions last season in his first year as a full-time starter. And I will say this, 4 of those interceptions just came in a really tough game against Mesa Ridge, which I want to say I was at here. And then another two of those came in a tough matchup versus Castleview at the very start of the season. So that's 6 of his 7 interceptions. Other than that, very efficient season here. I think there's definitely a lot of concern with him losing his top 2 star receivers, but I did get to watch him play, and I like his game. He throws a nice deep ball there, has some nice throws over the middle, and has obviously shown the ability to run a modern offense. And so I like what they have to work with here with Leland, and he's only going to be a junior, so you have another year with him after this one as well. But I really like what I saw here. Now we're going to see how good he truly is without his top two receivers, who both went on to play onto the next level here. And so I think that's going to show us a lot about Villanoz here as far as him as a prospect, but he is one of the better quarterbacks in the Springs and in the state in general. And so I think Doherty will be just fine on offense. It definitely could be worse. Speaking of fine on offense, they also bring back the 6'6", 290-pound monster in an incoming senior lineman, that is Maddox Richardson. I think he's a D1 caliber left tackle, and he also plays some defense as well here. Last season, struggled with some injuries, it seemed like. Did not see him play in that Coronado game, and I don't believe I saw him play in that Mesa Ridge game either, which is just tough. You obviously want to have that protection, that blindside protection for your quarterback, and he just wasn't able to play. On his huddle, he only listed like individual game-wise Mountain Range, Westminster, North Glen, I want to say, and Overland, which are all games at the end of the season. So it's just tough, that they didn't have him last season, but he comes back this season. I think he's arguably one of the best tackles in the entire state here, has a lot of raw power and athleticism, and I think that really is going to help out a Doherty offensive line that is losing two of their starting linemen, but you do get back Maddox Richardson, hopefully for the rest of this season, and that should go a long way for a line to at least build around a 6'6", 300-plus pound monster. They also bring back the majority of their defense here. I mean, they're losing just below half, it seems like, but they bring back Dominic Solano, who is an incoming senior DB. He racked up 56 tackles and 2 picks. He's going to be really important for that squad there, and you could probably see him potentially contribute a little bit more on offense as well. They also bring back Thomas Gillespie, the incoming senior. He's currently listed, I think, at 6'3", 6'4", 200-plus pounds at defensive end as a senior, but I feel like he's definitely bigger than that. So we'll see about that. But he had a pretty solid year last year, having kind of a breakout season and being one of their leaders on defense. And so I think bringing back those two on defense and the other two I mentioned on offense should go a long way for Doherty. They have a good core despite losing some big-time offensive production. That's just something that Maddox Richardson and Leland Villanoz got to figure out as the leaders of that offense. And then defensively, I mean, they're not losing everyone. They bring back a good amount of players here from all levels, and that should help them out as well. And on top of that, Doherty is also moving down from 5A to 4A here, which I do think contributes to them, maybe having an easier go around here to start this season. And to start the season, I mean, they play Liberty. Let's just get into the predictions here. I don't think there's any way they lose to Liberty. I think this is a really good confidence game to get them going here, so they win that one. But after that, then they travel. It's a really short trip, but it's up to Monument, who we'll talk about here in a minute, this team. But that team will be Palmer Ridge. They'll play Palmer Ridge, a team who went to state in 4A last year. And Palmer Ridge is also losing a lot. Like I said, we will talk about them later in this same episode, but I just don't think they're going to beat Palmer Ridge. Now, I think there's a solid chance that they make it competitive, and then anything could happen because it is the beginning of the season. Palmer Ridge is also reloading, having lost probably a lot more than Doherty has lost, but I mean, that's just a very well-coached team. They're used to winning, especially here on this 4A level. That's a difficult game here in Monument, which, I mean, the home field advantage I don't think is going to be that big of a deal. But, it's Palmer Ridge, right? And so I'm just going to go ahead and play it safe and call that a loss. Then they play Palmer, who I feel like they haven't played in a really long time. Kind of an old rivalry here. I think that's a dub. I don't think there's any way they lose to Palmer there. But then following that, they play Rampart here, playing a lot of tougher teams here in the Springs, which I think makes this really interesting. I think that's a loss. Like Palmer Ridge, Rampart has kind of been on the upswing here and has been really consistent consistent. Doherty played them last year, actually, and that was a close game, but, Doherty, they're losing a lot of the guys who made that a close game, while Rampart is returning a lot of those players. This is another team we'll talk about here later on in the episode, so I'll kind of just save it for then, but I like what Rampart is bringing back here, and, I just don't know if that is going to be a win here. I need more proven players to kind of rise up here for me to be comfortable with picking Doherty over Rampart, but another game that could potentially be competitive. Then they play Cheyenne Mountain at Cheyenne Mountain. I think this is going to be a really fun game. I think these two teams really match up well, especially on the front lines here. Cheyenne Mountain has always had very productive front seven players on the defensive line and that linebacker, so they're going to have their hands full up front, but Doherty I think they just have size, like they're bigger than them, honestly. And on top of that, they do have a more proven quarterback, as Cheyenne Mountain just graduated theirs, who was pretty good. And, this is another team we'll talk about later on in this episode, but I just like Doherty's experience more than Cheyenne Mountain. But this really is a toss-up game, so I'm going to give it to Doherty. But man, is that a toss-up game. Like, it's as close to 50-50 as it gets. Then they play Pueblo West. I think that's a loss. They return a lot of players, so I just don't think they're beating them. Then they make the long trip to Montrose. That's already difficult as is. We're going to talk about Montrose here later, but it's just really hard to win in Montrose. I think, I'm really trying to think about this. It's been a while since they've lost at home during the regular season. So there you go. I think it might have been maybe Grandview beat them 2 years ago. But like I said, it's been a really long time. It's a long trip. It's tiring. Plus their brand of football is really tiring to play against. And I just don't like the fact that Doherty is losing, some linebackers like a Micah Jacobs, Cooper, Brian Valdez, Marcus Chacon. I would have felt a lot better about that matchup if this was last year, but it's not. Then they play Falcon. They should beat him. There's no excuse not to. So there you go there. Following that, they play Mesa Ridge. I think and this is at Mesa Ridge, by the way. Mesa Ridge is going to be really good this year. We're going to talk about them later on in this episode, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, they will be later on in this episode. But last year, even with that stacked squad for Doherty, they lost them 28-0. Mesa Ridge does lose like a player, but they're just going to be so stacked over there. And so I think that's just a really tough game to win. Well, then they play Widefield, and I think they should beat them. And so altogether, my predicted record for them is actually 5-5, same as last year, but with a window of wins between 4 and 7. Look, this team has some solid talent. They're moving down to 4A, which I think is a lot more fit to, just what they are, right? As far as talent and roster has gone these last couple years, I think they're more of a 4A team than 5A team. So there you go. That definitely helps them out here. But, they got to reload, right? There's a lot of players that have to step up and replace production. You're losing almost 3,000 yards of offense between those three players alone, between Latimer, Hutchin, and Valdez, which is tough, on top of losing some linemen as well already. But you do have some key pieces, and so with that being said, I do think they should win at least 4 games. I'm looking at games like Liberty, Palmer, Falcon, Widefield. I think those 4 games are the one they could for sure win here. Now, you have a handful of games that I think are more or less, could go either way. Cheyenne Mountain, I think, is one of those games for sure. But then you also have games like Palmer Ridge, Rampart, which are very early on in the season. And I think those are games that, could be competitive, but I definitely still favor Palmer Ridge and Rampart in those matchups because of the history and the past success, consistent success they've had over these last couple seasons. So there you go there. But I do think ultimately, if it comes down to whether Doherty will make the playoffs or not, it'll depend on whether they could win those 4 games and then beat Cheyenne Mountain. If they beat Cheyenne Mountain, I think they could sneak into the playoffs. I really do, because they play some good teams like Palmer Ridge, Rampart, Pueblo West, Montrose, Mesa Ridge, who are all going to make the playoffs and could honestly all be, this is kind of crazy to say, but I do think they could all be teams who get a first round bye. And because of RPI and whatnot, that's going to look really good strength of schedule-wise, as long as they don't get beat by 70 in each of those games, which I think would really hurt them. But if they get to 500, specifically beating Cheyenne Mountain, then they make the playoffs here. And, we'll see what happens from there. But, they just have a really young team. We'll see what happens with Friscaz, how he develops and how this offense does. And then we'll see how this defense stacks up playing some pretty good teams in Palmer Ridge, Rampart, Cheyenne Mountain, Pueblo West, Montrose, Mesa Ridge, who are all going to run the ball a lot. And so whether this defense are good or not is really going to depend on how good they are defending the run. And with them losing so many linebackers, I honestly don't know. So we'll see what happens, but, excited to watch this Doherty team move forward here in 4A and compete this season. All right, now moving on just a little bit south here, we're going to talk about Widefield. Last year predicted them to go 9-1 and did say that they would win their conference and make it the playoffs, as they did play in that I-25 league there. And, they went 8-2, which was not bad. But the one game that they lost, and by the way, still within the window of wins, so I was still in the ballpark with that prediction. But the one game they lost was their second to last game to Centaurs, 41-21, who would go into the playoffs in their place. So basically, that was their league championship. Because they lost it, they did not make the playoffs, and with how the rules are in this I-25 league, only one team from that league could make the playoffs, and it's the league winner, and they didn't do that. And so despite them going 8-2, they missed out on the playoffs, unfortunately. And like I said, rest of their schedule went pretty much as I predicted. They beat Harrison, Air Academy, Pueblo, Centennial, and Thornton to go on a 4-game winning streak. Lost to Mesa Ridge, which I expected. That's a tough team there. But then they beat Gateway, Hinckley, and Palmer before losing to Centaurus and then beating Liberty at the end as expected, 30-14. And so kind of a tough one. I feel like also this was a closer game than a 3-score game would indicate here. And so that's just tough, that's definitely tough. And they do lose a couple players to graduation, starting with their quarterback, Paul Mitchell. He was actually our number 3 senior quarterback in this class of 2024. He had a standout senior year, throwing for 1,721 yards and 24 touchdowns, so only 6 interceptions, while also rushing for a pretty solid amount of yards here. 346 yards and 8 touchdowns. Obviously, he was their lead passer. He was just barely their second leading rusher, only 5 yards below the next guy, but he had the most rushing touchdowns here. And he was a top 5 guy for a reason, super talented. He had a great 2-year varsity career with Widefield. Is going to go down as one of the best athletes Widefield has ever had, honestly. And he's going to be missed. I mean, that's just a really tough player to replace there. The reason they've been so successful, I mean, Widefield has only lost like 3 games in 2 years. It's because of Paul Mitchell, in my opinion. He's played excellent football, and so that's just tough. On top of that, on the defensive side of the ball, they lose about half their defense. 7 of their top 13 tacklers. Aiden Snap was their lead tackler with 79 tackles and 29 tackles for loss, which is a lot, as well as 5 sacks and 18 hurries. He was their most productive player, so he'll be missed. They also graduate Deshaun James. He was used in a variety of ways. On offense, he rushed for 213 yards and 4 touchdowns, while catching for 368 yards and 4 touchdowns. He was their 3rd receiver, and I want to say 4th leading rusher for them. I mean, that's just somebody who was super productive there. They also lose Angelo Thomas, who's their 2nd lead receiver, with 491 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns on only 27 receptions. They lose their lead rusher in Connor Hazlett, who rushed for 351 yards and 4 touchdowns, as well as one of their best linemen here, and Landon Deal. So they're losing a lot of production, almost pretty much their entire offense, actually. Lose their quarterback, lose their top 4 rushers, lose their top three of their top four receivers here, and then lose some linemen as well as losing half their defense, including their leading tackler, as well as sack leader too, which is just tough. They also lose their interception leader with Deshaun James, who had 3 on the defensive side of the ball. So a lot of production going for Widefield here. Now the cupboard isn't exactly bare here. They have some players here. Let's start with Carson Martin, an incoming junior, and Kenyon Stanley, an incoming senior. Each of them had 50 tackles, so they're pretty productive. They'll be returning here. Martin and Stanley, I want to say, are both linebackers. Sorry, Martin's a linebacker, and then Stanley is a free safety. So you do return that. That's your second and third leading tackler. Which is not bad at all. I mean, they're only losing like half their defense, so, technically speaking, the talent level of this defense isn't just going to drop off like insanely or anything like that. Now, what I would be more worried about is this offense, but they do return a pretty key athlete here in Jalen Sankey, who is their lead receiver, bringing in 29 receptions for 557 yards and 7 touchdowns, averaging almost 20 yards a catch. I mean, he's an explosive athlete, but without Mitchell, it will be hard to imagine him replicating that receiving success. But like I said, an excellent athlete who could be the focal point of the offense. Maybe he plays more running back so he could get more touches, or maybe you put him at quarterback and you just run the ball a lot more. Either way, you have to get Jalen Sankey involved. We also got to watch him at this 7v7 Red Zone Elite tournament here, I want to say a month ago now, back in May, and he balled out for the 719 Springs Elite. He was crazy good. The athleticism, agility, it's all there. And so he's going to be a bright spot for this Widefield offense, and they're going to have to build around him because I legitimately think he is probably their best athlete on the squad right now. And he will be a senior next year. So we'll see what happens with Jalen Sankey. But it's not like Widefield just doesn't have talent. I mean, they bring back roughly, a little below half their defense, and they bring back a very productive athlete in Sankey, who, in theory, you should be able to build around, whether it's at running back or receiver, but I imagine it'd be more running back in case you don't have a quarterback. And so let's go ahead and talk about predictions here. It's going to be a tough go. So they play Cheyenne Mountain. I think that's automatically a loss, so that's tough. Then they play Liberty. Liberty is an equally bad team, but I like what Widefield brings back with Sankey and some of their players on defense. So I'm going to give them that dub. But then they play Air Academy. I think that's a loss. They're just bigger than them up front, to be honest with you. Sand Creek, they have a lot of weapons over there. They're going to pass the ball a lot. I don't really love that matchup going up against a Widefield defense that is losing, I feel like, a solid amount of DB, so I'm just not gonna, that's just gonna be a loss. Same with Discovery Canyon, Mesa Ridge. Both teams are gonna throw the ball, or can throw the ball, so I think those are 3 losses in a row. Pueblo West, they're not gonna throw it as much, but they're gonna run it, just like Montrose, who they're gonna play after Pueblo West, is also gonna run it, and they're just not going to be super good against the run this year either, I think. So that's tough. Then they play Doherty. Maybe this is a winnable game, but I just don't see it. Doherty has a lot of size up front. At least compared to Widefield, they have a lot of size up front. I don't think they have anybody that could match up well with a Maddox Richardson, who's 6'6", 300 pounds. And so that's a problem, right? That's definitely a problem. And so as far as their predicted record goes, and this is as of June 21st, so maybe they add a game. There's only 9 games here, but I have them going 1-8 with a window of wins between 0 and 3. This Widefield team, they leave the I-25 league, but they face such a much more difficult schedule here. Although they have 3A teams scheduled, they do play some better 3A teams in the springs here in Sand Creek and Discovery Canyon. I think Sand Creek maybe is a game that they could win. I feel like that is a team that has underperformed in the past, and so I think maybe they could sneak that one, but I don't think they're beating Discovery Canyon. So there's that. And then I just realized I forgot. Falcon is not scheduled here, but they're going to have to play them because they're in their league. So that does add to this. I don't think they're beating Falcon either, though. And so that would actually bring their predicted record to 1-9. So that's actually 10 games there. And I mean, when it comes to Falcon, I think that can be maybe a winnable game. And Falcon is losing some key offensive players, just like Widefield. But they do have some significant size up front that Widefield just doesn't have this year. I think losing Landon Deal is a really big blow. Because theoretically, you could always have him go against the opposing team's best defensive lineman or biggest one, and then, I guess, strategize the protection around him. But, I mean, it is what it is, right? And so right now I have them going 1-9, window of wins between 0 and 3. I think maybe they could beat Sand Creek, Liberty, and Falcon. Those are kind of their winnable games right now. But, I mean, I'm looking at a Montrose, Pueblo West, Mesa Ridge, Discovery Canyon. Those are all teams that are going to make the playoffs. Just straight up. Unless something goes horribly wrong, they should all make the playoffs. Then you have teams like Doherty, Cheyenne Mountain, probably throw in Sand Creek Air Academy. Those are all teams that are going to be competing for a spot in our fringe playoff teams, in my opinion, this season. And so it's just a very difficult schedule. I mean, they're going from playing like the likes of a Gateway, Hinckley, Palmer, Centaurus, Liberty, Thornton, Pueblo Centennial, to playing like 5 playoff teams. And they're also losing a lot of players from last year, too. So I just don't think it's going to translate well. And so I think it's going to be a down year. They're going to have to figure some things out, see the talent they have moving forward going into next season, a little bit of a rebuilding year. But as of right now, have them going 1-9 with a window of wins between 0 and 3. And if they do better, that's great. I think they are ahead of schedule if they do better. But this is going to be an uphill climb, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. All right, now moving on, we're going to go ahead and talk about another 4A team here in the Springs, and that is the Air Academy Cadets here, under a new head coach, by the way. But let's go ahead and talk about what happened last season. I predicted them going 2-8 with a window of wins anywhere between 1 and 4 here, and they actually went 4-6, so still within the window of wins. Let's talk about it. So, had them losing to Liberty here. Wasn't sure about that one, but they would end up beating them 21-14. So, there's that. They would beat Coronado, who I wasn't sure if they could beat, but they beat them by 2 points in kind of a crazy game, 28-26. So, there you go there. But then the rest of the schedule went as I predicted. They lost to Widefield 33-14. Beat Sand Creek though 41-8. Sierra 34-14. Would lose to Cheyenne Mountain. Kind of in a tough one here. I knew this would be a close game, and it was. Lost to them 30-21. Then lost to Vista Ridge, Palmer Ridge by over 50. Played Falcon, lost to them 42-25, and then lost to Rampart 47-7 here. I think the big story last year was that they were supposed to have Baruch Johnson, a standout quarterback, but then he moved, and I mean, it's for military reasons. He moved out of state. And on top of them losing a great player in Sam Beers, arguably the greatest player to ever play for Air Academy, that really put them in a tough spot where they would have to be rebuilding. And so that's what they did, but they went 4-6, which isn't too bad here. I think playoffs was never really going to happen. I think after they lost to Widefield, that kind of hurt their playoff chances. But then you play Coronado close, even though you still beat him, you still play them close. That's not good for RPI. Lost to Cheyenne Mountain by 9. And then the Falcon game wasn't too bad. Only lost to them 42-25. But, I mean, that's still a 17-point loss. And so that's tough. They just missed out on that. But let's talk about some graduating seniors and departures. Let's start with the players. They lose King David Rogers, who's their lead receiver, with 28 receptions for 289 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was an exceptional athlete for them. I feel like a very underrated athlete for them, but that's a tough loss there. They also lose Gabe Delamuth, who, got his first start, like real start as the lead guy for Air Academy here his senior season, and he ran for 1,015 yards, 10 touchdowns. No Sam Beers, but, still very productive in that system. They also lose Jason Jones, who and it looks like he was their lead tackler. I want to say these stats are not complete on offense, or sorry, not offense, on defense, and I do not know why. It's kind of just weird here because I know these players played, so hopefully that changes. But they lose a Jason Jones, who's their lead tackler. He had 18 tackles, and they lose a solid amount of this defense, just below half. 6 of their top 13 tacklers will be graduating. On top of that, they lose their head coach, Scott Grindy. I want to say it's Grindy, who has led their program since 2016 here. So they will be moving on from him. But before I talk about key players, they do bring in a new head coach here in Waymond Jackson II, who actually coached a bunch of college teams and high school teams over the past couple years. Former defensive coordinator and linebackers coach over there. Coached at South Carolina under Steve Spurrier, whole legend, which is big time. And he's coached a couple NFL players, as well as coaching at a bunch of different high schools. In Colorado, recently coached at Gateway in Aurora for a season. That was about 10 years ago now, and Gateway's a tough program to co-coach, so I don't think you could really judge him off of that. But he was the DC over at Gwinnett County Public Schools over in Georgia, so definitely more than qualified for this job here, looking to lead this Air Academy team in a new era moving forward. So that's definitely going to be exciting. On top of that, for Air Academy, they actually bring back a solid amount of players. Let's start with their standout tight end / defensive end, Caleb Kaseka here. The 6'4", 200-pound athlete was super productive. I think this season there's a good chance that he could be their lead receiver and also take on a bigger role on the defense. And so got to look out for him. He's going to be big time. They also bring back incoming senior lineman Jackson Downs, 6'5", 300 pounds as a defensive tackle and the right tackle for last year. Was a big reason why that offensive running game was so good for Air Academy, despite them losing some key players, obviously, in that rushing attack, but he was a big part of that. Also was their third leading tackler on defense, and so I think he could be really fun to watch here in the fall, but he's just a force down low. On top of that, they bring back Jake Ballard. He was their second leading tackler. It was arguably their best athlete, who went off for 142 receiving yards on Cheyenne Mountain in that game alone. And with him being one of their best athletes, he could be moved to running back just to get a better chance at getting the ball more. So we'll just see about that. And then last but not least, they bring back their quarterback from last season, Maddox Daniels. He will be returning with these other seniors at quarterback. Had an okay season last year, throwing for 1,072 yards, 9 touchdowns and 10 picks. He needs to take a step forward and play, just a lot more efficiently, going into this next season for them to, do better than last year for sure. But I think it's possible. If you look at the quarterback before him in Doherty, I never figured out how to say his name. But, he had a similar stat line to Daniels his junior year before having a very productive senior year there. And I think Daniels could take that step forward similarly, and that could really go a long way for them. And he has some weapons. He has a 6'4" tight end, a solid line, some good athletes around him. So it's definitely possible. But, let's go ahead and talk about this season here. To start, they will play Cheyenne Mountain here. And unfortunately, I think this early on, that's probably a loss. If they played this same team later on the season, I think they would have had a better chance. But I think this is just a really quick turnaround. You have a new coaching staff and all that. You're trying to figure out some things there. I think that's just going to be a loss, right? And usually these games have been close in the past, so I think there's a good chance that it's competitive. But I think this early on, it's just too early for Air Academy. So unfortunately, I think they dropped that one. Then they play Mesa Ridge. They're not winning that one. Sand Creek, I think they could beat them. They have a little bit more size than them. Defensively, I like how they match up with them. So I'm going to give them that dub. But we'll see about Sand Creek there. Who knows, right? Then they play Widefield. That should be a win. They play Stanley Lake. Stanley Lake likes to run the ball. I think this team is very well equipped to stop the run, especially when you have a big defensive lineman like a Jackson Downs and a Caleb Kaseka here on the edge. I think that's a good amount of size to stop that Stanley Lake rush that they are known for. They then play Sierra. I think that's another win there. But then here, I mean, they start their league play here. They go ahead and play Palmer Ridge. I think that's a loss. They go play Durango next. I think this is going to be a close one. I'm going to call it a loss for now because I feel like Durango's very well coached. You know, they're losing some good players for sure. I think offensively you could definitely be more worried about them if you're Durango, but defensively they've always done well stopping the run. They're a tough team, right? So I'm going to just call that a loss for now, but that's kind of a toss-up in my opinion. They then play Vista Ridge. I think that's a loss. Rampart, unfortunately, is another loss there. And then this is a team that is in their league in Liberty. It's not scheduled yet here. And actually, no, never mind. I just missed it. They do play Liberty. It's between the Palmer Ridge and Durango game is when they play Liberty here. And so that should be a dub. They should beat Liberty for sure. And interesting enough, they have 11 games scheduled. So I wonder if one of these games will be dropped. But it is spaced out pretty evenly. I just don't think they have a bye, which is interesting. I guess they just won't have a bye. I don't know. We'll see what happens there for Air Academy. But right now I have them going 5-6 with a window of wins anywhere between 4 and 7. For Air Academy, they do have new leadership, but they do bring back a lot of good athletes and some solid size up front here. I think they have 4 pretty close to guaranteed wins this season. Pretty close to guaranteed. I really like them against Widefield, Sierra, Liberty, and then Stanley Lake to a degree. Could be a tougher game, but I just don't think they lose to that team. So that's 4 wins right there. That puts you in a good spot. Then Durango, I think, could be a toss-up, as well as Sand Creek in some ways. And so maybe you get a couple more wins, and then maybe you beat a Cheyenne Mountain. But it is the beginning of the season. That's kind of a tough game to play early on. Also kind of a rivalry too. So there's just more things at stake. There are other factors to consider when playing a rival so early on in the season. And I just don't know about that, right? But other than that, this Air Academy team should be pretty solid here. Like I said, they have those 4 wins, right? So they'll do at least as well as they did last season, I believe. But, you know, there's a good chance that they could get over 500. They need other players to step up, though, on offense. I am worried about the offensive production. Defensively, I mean, they have a defensive-minded head coach. Plus, I mean, I like who they have on the defensive side, too. I think they'll be fine on that side of the ball. I'm more worried about the offensive side, especially losing a Delamuth and a King David Rogers. That's a lot of talent and production, I feel like, that you are losing. They're over 1,400, 300, I want to say. So that's just not something you can replace so easily. But you know what? Who knows? We'll learn a lot about this coaching staff this first season. Air Academy, I mean, they'll have an alright season. Maybe they're a fringe playoff team, but I think they're only really a playoff team if they beat a Vista Ridge, Rampart, Palmer Ridge, or a Mesa Ridge, right? If they beat one of those teams, I think they make the playoffs with a 500 or better record. And if they're not, then, I mean, they're just going to have to continue to build and use this as a sort of rebuilding season / getting better season for these next couple years here where they should have more talent. So there you go there, but that is Air Academy. The next program we're going to talk about here is Cheyenne Mountain. Last year predicted them to go 6-4 with a window of wins between 3 and 7. They would finish just below what I predicted, but still within the window of wins. They actually went 4-6 there. A lot of that was because they had to go a stretch without their starting quarterback Bruce Archambault, as he did have a hand injury, and so that did kind of hurt them a pretty solid amount there. But, you know, let's go ahead and talk about how their season went. So, to start, they played Pueblo East and Greeley Central. Those are both teams that I felt like they could have won and beat. Against Pueblo East, I mean, they were a lot better than what I thought they would be. So even if Bruce was healthy for that entire game, I don't know if that's necessarily a dub. And then they played Greeley Central, and I felt like it was really obvious that they were missing Bruce here, as, you know, it was a pretty close game at halftime, and then just kind of got away from them as they couldn't get anything going. And so those 2 games would really hurt Cheyenne Mountain's season. And because of that, I would say was the reason why they finished just outside of the playoffs here, which, it's just tough. It's honestly just tough. But the rest of the season, they go on a 2-game winning streak after that Greeley Central loss, beating Canyon City and Pueblo Centennial. They'd lose to Denver South, which I feel like was pretty expected. They'd beat Air Academy, which was a key game, I thought, for them. Lost to Rampart. They would play Vista Ridge in a real close one. 42-32 was the final score of that one. That would have been a key game for them to win. If they won that game, that probably would have, I would imagine, would have made up for those 2 losses early on in the season, and that would have put them in the playoffs, but unfortunately just came up short there. Then they lost to Palmer Ridge as expected, 54-7, and beat Coronado as expected. So, not a bad season at all for Cheyenne Mountain. Injuries ultimately kind of hurt their season there as they came up just short of the playoffs at 4-6. Now, speaking of graduating seniors, we already talked about one of those, and that is Bruce Archambault here on the year in 8 games, threw for 1,121 yards, 14 touchdowns and 10 picks, while also rushing for 205 yards and a touchdown. Like I said, injuries kind of played a role here. Just had a tougher start to the season. Probably didn't have as good a season as he wanted, but still a very good quarterback that they will be losing. They also they also graduate Troy Heralt here, who was the leading rusher with 896 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns, averaging almost 10 yards a carry, actually, while also catching an additional 9 receptions, 181 yards, while having 69 tackles as one of their top defensive leaders and tacklers. Just doing it all for Cheyenne Mountain, so that's tough versatility that they're going to miss there. They also graduate Jackson Garrett, who was a pretty tall tight end for them. He was their leader in touchdown receptions with 5, only had 20 receptions, 445 yards there, but he was big time for them. They also graduate their second lead receiver and third and fourth lead receivers here, actually, in Hanson, Waterhouse, and Weinstein. They had 227 yards, 219 yards, 214 yards, respectively there between those players, and a bunch of touchdowns. And then on defense, they unfortunately lose Levi Hauger here, or Holger, I want to say. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but he was their lead tackler with 87. And on top of that, just in general, they're losing 7 of their top 13 tacklers, which does include 4 of their top 5, which does include Heralt, Griffin LaRue, who was big time, and Regain for them. So definitely losing some very productive players over here on both sides of the ball for Cheyenne Mountain. By the way, Bruce Archambault, a 3-year starter, so that's going to be tough without him. But they do have some pretty solid talent coming in. Starting with the quarterback, I want to talk about him first, Sam Hawker. He's going to be an incoming junior this year, but got to watch him play, and I assume he is going to be the starter. And, at 6 foot 180, he's a pretty good athlete who I consider a dual threat. Against Greeley Central, he was 9 of 22, not super efficient, but threw for 109 yards, a touchdown, and 2 picks. Also rushed for 25. Against Canyon City, the next game, he would rush for 112 yards and a touchdown in that win there. And, in the 100 meter, this isn't necessarily super related, but it is because it does say, or tell you at least, how fast he is. But he ran in the low 12s, so he definitely has some speed there, and I think altogether is a good athlete. Throws a nice ball, has a good arm, has good mobility, but another offseason under his belt, some time to really learn. I think he could be a pretty good quarterback for Cheyenne Mountain moving forward, and a solid option for them. So definitely not too down on the quarterback position. It's going to be tough replacing Bruce and his leadership, but Hawker at least showed some good athleticism there, which hopefully will translate going into his junior year, assuming he gets better. In addition, they bring back Tyler Chris, who was statistically their lead receiver. On 17 receptions, had 230 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also has some solid speed as well, and so that's probably going to be the wideout one. He's going to be a senior, by the way, next year for Hawker next season, so that'll be big time. They also bring back Connor Cavaney here. He was one of their most productive tacklers of the 45. Cheyenne Mountain has always kind of found people to replace that defensive production, and so he'll help a less experienced crew here. But it's going to be key to have a couple of those guys there. They also bring back Wyatt Boley. He is the brother. He's one of a long line of Boleys here. A lot of his brothers played here at Cheyenne Mountain and were very good, and so he'll be big on both sides of the ball. Last year had 31 tackles, and this upcoming season, I believe, will be only his junior year, so a lot of potential there, very high on him. And then last but not least, they do bring back a very talented safety here in McCoy Huckstep. He's 6'4", 165, so a tall safety for them. But last year had 40 tackles and 4 interceptions from that safety spot. I believe he was the leader in picks, so that's going to be big time bringing him back to kind of hold down that back end of the defense, and he would do that as a senior. Duncan Albright, by the way, was third in interceptions with 3, and he will be an incoming sophomore this year. So definitely some pieces for Cheyenne Mountain to bring back. Historically speaking, they have usually done a pretty good job replacing the production they lose year by year, but there is a lot that they are losing. But you do kind of just got to trust the coaching staff here, who I believe will be returning and is, in my opinion, I think very highly of Jay's Service over there, the head coach for them, the longtime head coach for them since 2017. And, like I said, they've done a good job bringing back talent and developing that talent and getting the most out of them production-wise. And so I'm really high on Cheyenne Mountain in that sense. They'll be young, but there's still some talent there. They got experience last year too, which is really important. But looking at their season here, this upcoming season, they start with a game against Air Academy. I think that'll be a close one, but I'm going to give it to Cheyenne Mountain. I just like who they bring back, and they bring a little bit more continuity than Air Academy would have, who has a new head coach and all that great stuff as well. And honestly, I think that will be the start of a 5-game winning streak to start the season, as they play Air Academy to start, then Widefield, Pueblo Centennial, Coronado, Canyon City. I really feel like those are all wins right there. I think with the talent they have straight up, they just have more talent than all those teams. Those should be wins there. The Air Academy game might be a little bit closer, but I still trust them to win that one. And then they play Doherty at home. That should be a very good one. That's one that I'm kind of eyeing to attend in person here to see all the great talent that both teams have, and I think that's going to be a tough one. They have a little bit more size. I think they have a lot more size actually than Cheyenne Mountain. I like Cheyenne Mountain's defense better though. They've always been really productive against the run and have usually been pretty disciplined, and so I like them, but I just think Doherty is just bigger. They have the better quarterback too in Leland Friscaz as of right now, and so I think I gotta go with Doherty, but I do acknowledge that really could go Cheyenne Mountain's way though. So there you go. Then they play league games, and they're in the I-25 league, and honestly, I don't think there's anybody in this league that could really beat them. They play Centaurus, they play Thornton, Grand Junction, and Gateway. Those should all be wins. They also play Sand Creek, which I feel like is playing up a little bit, but I think that's a win for Cheyenne Mountain as well. I think they're just bigger and just better coached than most of these teams, just being straight up honest with you. And so honestly, this schedule is really not that bad for Cheyenne Mountain. They play 11 games, and I have them going 10-1 with a window of wins between 7 and 11 here. Look, Cheyenne Mountain has always been consistent. They are a pretty well-coached team who's disciplined. I think there should really be no reason that they lose a league game. I'd be surprised if they do. And then on their schedule as a whole, Doherty is really the only game that I'm questionable about, the only game that I don't really have them favored in. I think the Air Academy game you could probably throw in there as well, but I really feel like Cheyenne Mountain should win the rest of the schedule, and if they do, that should be a free ticket to the playoffs, as they are in that I-25 league, and whoever wins the league goes to the playoffs. And so I just really think this is Cheyenne Mountain's year there. I'd be surprised if they lost some of these games, because really they're just like just not good teams that they're playing on their schedule here. And I don't think there's any excuse to not make the playoffs or at least get over 500. With the talent that they have, I really like Hawker. They bring back Chris as well. They have other pretty solid players on the defense like Cavani and Boley and Huckstep. I just like what they have over there, and I think they're going to figure it out. So I'm going with Cheyenne Mountain here at 10-1 with the window of wins between 7 and 11. If the past has shown anything, they're very capable of this. So there you go. That's Cheyenne Mountain. Next here, we're going to go ahead and talk about Rampart. This was a team that actually exceeded expectations. Last year, I predicted them going 4-6 with the window of wins between 3 and 5, but they actually went 6-4 in the regular season, just finishing one game outside of the window of wins I had them at, which was 3 and 5. Honestly, I think this team is on the upswing here moving forward, but let's break it down. To start, they beat Coronado, which, I expected them to do. Then they played Doherty. This was a game I thought they would lose. I did say it would be a closer game as Doherty is bigger, which I felt like would be an issue for Rampart, but Rampart would go ahead and match their physicality there and more, which I thought would be key to their game, and they'd win a relatively close one there, 28-18, putting them away, and so that was big time. Doherty didn't have Maddox Richardson, I believe, which I think is a pretty big difference, but I still would have given Rampart that win in hindsight, which, as we all know, is 2020. Then the rest of their schedule would pretty much go as expected, would beat Palmer, would lose to Dakota Ridge, Heritage, and Palm Ridge. That's just a tough stretch there, to be honest with you. Then they beat Cheyenne Mountain 42-6, like I thought. And then they played Vista Ridge. This was the first game that I really felt like was a big-time upset for them, as they beat them 35-19. Which is huge, and there's no real excuses for Vista Ridge here. They had Zayden Stevens back by this point after he was gone the previous games, but they just straight up beat him. That's it. Rampart beat them, and that was a big upset there that really boosted Rampart's chances at making the playoffs, which was key. And so from there, they would go on and beat Air Academy and then beat Grand Junction Central. They would make the playoffs, and then they would go ahead and beat Grand Junction Central in the first round. That one wasn't even close, 48-6, before losing to Erie 52-0, who were the eventual state champs. So not a bad run for Rampart, going 6-4 in the regular season, 7-5 as a whole, as they went 1-1 in the playoffs, getting to that second round there, and only losing to the eventual state champs. If you're a Rampart, you got to feel pretty good about where your season ended and, where you could go going into this next season. But before we talk about this next season, let's talk about some of the players they are losing, as they are losing some big-time playmakers, starting with their running back, Masu Ramaka, who was the workhorse as expected on 135 carries, running for 1,212 yards on 9 yards a carry, by the way, which is insane. And also had 19 rushing touchdowns, as he was their offense, most of their offense, honestly, which I don't know. That's just crazy. I'm not going to lie. Which was expected. It was definitely expected. It's not that crazy. But, 19 touchdowns and 212 yards. That's big time, especially in an offense where they don't really pass it well. And speaking of that, they have their senior quarterback, Hayden Benoit, graduating, who wasn't the worst QB for them. Was pretty solid. 1,170 passing yards, 7 touchdowns to 7 picks, 58% completion percentage there. Also added on 245 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns. He was a solid, all right quarterback. Obviously didn't lean on him for a reason there. But, he was a solid quarterback for them that they're going to be losing. He started the last 2 or 3 years, I believe. On top of that, they also lose Riggs Riker, who was their lead receiver at tight end. He had 28 receptions for 401 yards and 2 touchdowns. Also had 20 tackles and a pick on defense. And then on the defensive side of the ball, they lose some players. Specifically, Peter Richardson is a pretty big loss here. I believe he was an all-PMC defensive lineman, if I wasn't mistaken there. But he had 10 sacks and was third in tackles of 56 as a very productive tackler for them. And altogether, I mean, Rampart, they're losing 7 of their top 13 tacklers, which does include 3 of their top 5 and their second, third, and fifth tacklers. So some tough production they got to lose there, but they do bring back a pretty good amount of talent and some good talent at that, starting with, I think, who is going to be their star here in Camden Bruns here. He will be an incoming senior this season. Standing now, I believe he's listed at 6'2", 220 pounds as a running back and linebacker. But at running back, he was the other part of this offense, rushing for 1,018 yards and 9 touchdowns on 152 carries. Also caught 5 receptions for 109 yards and a touchdown. You know, kind of being that, I guess, other back that they rotated in with Ramaka there. Getting the full workload a couple times. I mean, you see him against Vista Ridge. He tore them apart. 24 carries, 157 yards, and a touchdown. That was a high in rushing yards and carries, by the way. You also saw him against Heritage, where he had 18 carries for 93. Palmer Ridge, who went to state, by the way, 18 carries for 107 yards there. Against Erie, the eventual state champions, he rushed for 95 yards. I mean, he's a monster. You know, he's a monster they got over there. And he has all PMC, MVP, OPOY, maybe even DPOY potential there. And I say DPOY potential because he was also their lead tackler with 96 total tackles, 15 tackles for loss, 3 sacks. Like I said, 6'2", 220, a freak athlete over there. He could be due for an MVP-like season for Rampart. He's a big talent for them, and so really looking forward to what they got coming up. They also bring back Maxwell Wrighton here, the incoming senior. He plays cornerback, had 40 tackles and 2 interceptions, which is good enough to be a top 5 tackler on this team last year, that is. Got to watch him play for a team for Gorilla Memorial Day weekend in that 7v7 tournament, and I really liked his game. I think he's going to be really good for them. I think he's a really good corner who, you know, is going to take advantage of all the pressure that front 7 is going to bring over there, and he's going to lock down his guy, or at least his part of the field. And he's actually tied, or not tied, with 2 other guys for that lead interception spot. He only had 2, but Mark Suplisson and James Royer were the other guys who had 2 interceptions each. And so all those 3 will be returning back, which is very good for the secondary for sure there. So there you go there. They also bring back Justice Derrickson, a 6'5", 250-pound defensive end slash tackle. He plays tackle, but I mean, he's a very good defensive end for them. Last year was second in sacks with 6.5, right behind Peter Richardson, but he also racked up 32 tackles, 13 tackles for loss. He's a big body to have that tackle on the O-line. And then on defense, I mean, he's going to produce some pressures. I think against Doherty, his presence was very much felt in that game, and so I think he could take another step forward and be even better, as this defense is gonna look really good, led by Bruns, Reedon, and Derrickson. That's a good group right there. 3 really good players on those levels of that defense, which you could absolutely get behind if you are Rampart. On top of that, they do bring back a quarterback who got some experience last year here in Connor Marco, 6'1", 205 pounds. He will be a senior. It'll be his chance to shine potentially. He'll get an opportunity to compete for that starting job here. And honestly, I don't know if he'll be the starter or if it'll be someone else, but whoever plays quarterback has to be able to match some of the production that Benoit had last year and help out this Rampart offense, as a lot of attention will be around Camden Bruns. I mean, he's going to do a lot naturally to, you know, produce and whatnot anyways, but I think Rampart could really take that step forward if they could get a quarterback who could take some of that pressure off of him. On top of that, I do think that they're going to bring out another, or at least give more opportunities to another running back here in Khalid Elwazir, or El-Wazir here. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong. I'm pretty sure it's El-Wazir here. but he will be an incoming junior running back, 5'7", so a little undersized here. But on only 29 carries on varsity last season, he went for 200 yards and 4 touchdowns on those carries. While the sample size is small, you look at the film, and he's a shifty running back with good vision and speed here. With Ramaka gone in questions at QB, I think Elwazir here could be poised for a breakout season, being a good 1-2 punch with Bruns over there. Bruns being the Thunder and Elwazir being the Lightning. And I think that is a recipe for another potential winning season here for Rampart. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and go to their schedule and make some predictions here. To start, they play, or at least, their schedule is not complete yet. I'm just going to throw this out there. But to start here, at least according to what they have right now, they play Ponderosa on September 6th. I think, unfortunately, that's a loss. Pondo does bring back their quarterback in Marcus Price, who was really good last year when healthy. And, you also add on that they have Max Mervin over there. They have a solid line. Their defense is always good. That's going to be a tough game to win. Now, is it impossible for them to win? No. And in fact, Rampart actually plays them at home right here at D20 Stadium. That might be a game that I go to in person. That'll be a fun one here. But that's going to be a good test for Rampart to see how they stack up against a team that's a perennial playoff team and, a contender most years. So I think that's going to be a good one. But following that, the following week, they play Discovery Canyon. I want to say on Saturday. This is another game I might look at. DCC, they got a quarterback over there. They got some really good pieces. They also have some size as well that matches up relatively all right with the Rampart. I think that's going to be a really good game. I'm going to give it to Rampart, though, as I think they're just more physical, and their offense could definitely give this DCC defense some issues over there if they're not tackling well and on top of it. So I'm going to give them that win. Then they play Doherty. This is at Gary Berry Stadium the following week. I think that's a dub. Doherty, they do have some size, but last year Rampart showed that they could handle that just fine. And on top of that, Doherty will be without Latimer and Logan Hutchin and Brian Valdez, which does matter. And so I'm going to give this one to Rampart here. They're going to be able to run the ball well and play tough defense. That's just what it's going to be. Following that, they play Durango here at home. I think that's a dub. Durango, a less experienced team, also their first year in 4A. And on top of that, they don't have to travel to Durango. I think that's a win. Then they play Vista Ridge. They beat this team last year. And honestly, I think they beat them again this year. Vista Ridge, we'll talk about them later on in this preview, but they are losing a pretty good amount of players who are just transferring, as well as some who are graduating too. While Rampart, you lose Masu Ramaka, you lose your quarterback, who, didn't do too much. And then they do lose Peter Richardson, but he was undersized. So, you can replace some of that. Honestly, it's not impossible. But other than that, they have everyone else. And I think they are just returning more than Vista Ridge. And even then, they still beat them last year straight up. And so, on top of them returning everyone, I think they just win this game here. I like this one. It's also, Vista Ridge with a new coaching staff. I don't know what the growing pains will be, but I'm not a big fan of them. Just thinking about that. Following that, they play Liberty. That's a dub. And then they play Air Academy. I think that's also a dub. And then it's not listed yet here, but they will have to play Palmer Ridge as that is a league game. I'm going to say it's a loss for now, but I do think they can beat a Palmer Ridge team that honestly might not have the same type of firepower that they had last year that, they used to go to state. I think of this year, it's a little bit different, and this Rampart defense could do a pretty solid job against that Palmer Ridge offense and keep this game close. And then I think anything could happen from there. So with that being said, only 7 games scheduled. I also added on the Palmer Ridge game. That would make 8 because that's a league game. They have to play them. I give them a predicted record of 6-2. I expect them to add on a couple games, so I'm going to go ahead and give them a window of wins between 5 and 8. Look, I'm not going to lie. I might be way too high on them, but this is a run-heavy team that have the backs to tear up a lot of team. I really like Camden Bruns. He's an issue. Just seeing what he did against the 2 teams who went to state last year, I could imagine a lot worse against a lot of other teams this season. You add on that they have a promising back in Khalid over there. They have a pretty good defense led by Derrickson, Reed, and Bruns. I like what they have, and Rampart has always been well coached defensively. You know, watching some of their spring games here with their 8th grade squads, they have some of those players coming up, and I feel really good about where they're at here. And so I think this season they go over 500 and make the playoffs again. Now, they also made the playoffs last year before losing to the eventual state champs. So I think the bigger question that is to be asked is, can this team contend for a state title, right? Or can they even be a contender, make it to the Elite Eight or the Final Four, any of that, right? And I think that's harder to answer because there are questions at quarterback and you don't know how much production you're going to get from them. On top of that, they're a run-heavy team, so they're kind of capped. I mean, if there's going to be teams who are really good against the run. Like, I'm thinking of a Ponderosa, who has always been one of those teams, historically speaking, right? I think maybe this year might be a little bit different, you know. They might not be as good, but historically speaking, they've always been good against the run. Broomfield is one of those teams as well who's been good against the run. And so, you know, if you're Rampart, to go deep, you gotta have a diverse you just gotta have diverse play calling, or at the very least, just diverse options. You can't just rely on Bruns to win you games. You just can't, because what if he goes down, right? And so for them to truly be a contender, it's gonna be dependent on how good their quarterback is this season, or is capable of this season. And so we'll see what happens. I think they're for sure a playoff team. If they're not a playoff team, it's pretty disappointing. I mean, this is a team that is playing some good teams here, so RPI shouldn't be an issue, in my opinion. And, I mean, there's a lot of winnable games. You know, there's a lot of winnable games here for Rampart. So we'll see what happens. I'm excited for them. I think they have some bona fide stars, some potential top 5 guys, top 5 senior guys with Bruns and Derrickson and Reedon, just to name a few there. And I think that's absolutely exciting to think about. I mean, this is probably arguably maybe the most exciting Rampart has been since the Kale Cormani era, which was a couple years ago. So we'll see what happens for Rampart, but very exciting season ahead for them. Alrighty, now let's go ahead and talk about Falcon here. I predicted them to go 5-5 with a window of wins between 3 and 6 here. They ended up going 4-6 in the regular season, just finishing one game below where I thought they would be here, and just a game below 500. Now, there was only one game I was wrong about. And here, before I go and talk about that one game, I'll talk about the rest of the season. So as predicted, I mean, everything else went pretty much as planned. Or I should say as predicted here, as they lost to Fountain Fort Carson 49-18, bounced back with a dub over G-Dub 27-12, beat Aurora Central 42-0, lost to Vista Ridge as expected 41-21, and then this is where the one wrong prediction comes in here. They played Lewis Palmer, and I felt like this would have been a close game, but I still had Falcon, you know, pulling away with this one and winning it. And so me and Gino actually went to this game, and they would lose it 27-7, and it was a pretty close game. They scored a garbage time touchdown at the end there in the 4th. LP did, that is. But it was pretty competitive for the most part. Like, it wasn't ever like way out of reach here. But a key thing to know in that game is that Gabriel McFarland, one of their star running backs, honestly, he didn't play. Wasn't injury or anything like that. He was held out by the coach. And I think that costed them that game, just being honest there. I don't know if they would have won it, but they would have had a way better chance with Gabe. And so that's a tough one there. And that almost costed them the playoffs. But they would go ahead and beat Coronado 63-22, lose to Montrose as predicted 56-22. Then they play Pueblo West and kind of stay close to them here. Didn't get blown out, only lost 33-19. And then they beat Air Academy, which was absolutely huge here for them to win 42-25. Then at the end of the season, lost to Mesa Ridge 35-12, which wasn't bad. But, you know, all that being said, with RPI and point differential kept in mind and whatnot, they actually made the playoffs for the first time, I want to say, since I want to say it's the spring of 2020, or I guess it'd be the spring, so 2021, that COVID year where they would make the playoffs here. And, they were the 20th seed, so not the last seed in the playoffs, but they made it. And they play Fuda Monument and get blown out 50-12, but still made the playoffs, which was pretty good for them to even be in that position there, despite even losing to LP and having a losing record, making the playoffs. So there you go there. Now, there were a pretty good amount of seniors on this squad, starting with Carter Thorpe, who's been their quarterback for a couple of seasons now, used more as a running back. He runs the ball a lot, but last year threw for 733 yards, 5 touchdowns, 10 picks, but most importantly, rushed for 1,381 yards and 14 touchdowns. He was their lead rusher by almost 800 yards there, which is absolutely big time. A good leader for them, and so unfortunately he'll be graduating and moving on, and so that's going to be kind of a tough guy and player to lose for that locker room and for the team in general. They also graduate Ashton Luttrell, who was an all-around player, rushed for 221 yards, also was their lead receiver with 317 yards and 5 touchdowns, also played defense where he had 26 tackles and a pick. They also graduate Corey Hotel, who is a bigger body on the line, 6'3", 235. He had 40 tackles as one of the top tacklers on this team. And speaking of top tacklers on the team, they lose 7 of their top 13, which it does include 3 of their top 5 to graduation. And most notably, they are losing everyone who notched a sack as well. So a lot of pass rushers, it seems. Nosita, Nas, Gonzalez, all gone as well. So a pretty good amount of players to replace here. Solid amount of that defense they got to let go of. As well as their offense. And actually, I almost forgot, but they will be without another one of their big producers on offense. So not only will they not have their top passer, rusher, and lead receiver, they will also be without their second leading rusher, and that will be Gabriel McFarland, and I got it straight from the source, as he is now going to play his senior year at Vista Ridge. This is as of June 21st, 2024, so if something changes within that week or before the season, then, it's beyond my control, right? But he has transferred to Vista Ridge to play his senior year. He rushed for 584 yards and 9 touchdowns for Falcon as that running back, and also had 11 tackles on defense too here, and he did that on 10 yards per carry, which is kind of a lot. And obviously, he comes from a line of McFarland's. His older brother played and is now playing for, I want to say, Western. He's on the D2 level here, and he was an excellent running back. Gabe, he was another guy in that long line of players. And now he's over at Vista Ridge. And so Falcon is in kind of a tough spot here. But let's talk about the key players they bring back, because they do bring back a running back in Ethan Mangrum here, who is going to have to step up no matter what. He's going to be the main guy. Got 52 carries last season and was their third leading rusher as a freshman, mind you, only a freshman. But he rushed for 300 yards and 5 touchdowns with Carter Thorpe gone, Gabe McFarland gone, Luttrell also gone, who had some carries in this offense, as well as Bergolowski, who had 36 carries in this offense. Now it's Ethan Mangrum's backfield, and so we'll see what happens. He averaged 5.8 yards per carry, which is pretty solid for this squad, and so at the very least, it's not like they're not returning anybody who had, some sort of playing time on offense. They at least have Ethan Mangrum here, which I think is going to go a long way for this team. So we'll see what happens there. But on defense, they got some players. They got some big players and a pretty solid defense returning, starting with their lead tackler, Jaden Brewster, the linebacker, entering his senior year, 6'1", 225 pounds. He had 66 tackles, and, he's going to lead this team going into next season, as they're going to have to be more defensive focused. But Brewster, he's a tough linebacker against the run. He's a good linebacker in general, could potentially be an all-PMC guy. And so we'll see what happens there, but I mean you could pretty much count on him to be super productive this next season, as they're gonna have to be. On top of that, they return Alex Griswold here, who is a 6'5", 310-pound nose guard / defensive tackle. He's only going to be a junior this next year, which is kind of wild, but he's only going to be a junior next year. And last season, he had 18 tackles. I think that workload hopefully should go up, as he should definitely be a force for that squad. Speaking of linemen, you also have Luis Guerrera. I mean, he's more of an offensive lineman. He's 6'2", 270 pounds, and he's a pretty solid guard that they have for them as well. But he'll also be returning. He's going to help out this run game a lot, I think. But defensively, I think if he could step up next to Griswold over there, as well as Brewster, at linebacker, I think they're going to be in a really good spot. And altogether, I mean, this defense, they return Ashton Macy, Jacob Hunter, Brody Mitz, who are all just incoming juniors and were top 10 tacklers last season. And so there's some good consistency coming back. They do lose a good amount of their defense, but they have some really good young talent coming back, led by the linebacker Jaden Brewster and his two big defensive tackles as well. So I think this is a Falcon team that, they're losing a lot of offensive firepower, but they do have some pretty exciting defensive capabilities. They got a solid defense, for sure, to say the least, and you definitely can't complain about that. Now, we're going to hop into the predictions. Their schedule is not complete as of June 21st. I've filled in what I can with league stuff, but we're just going to do our best here. And so to start, they play George Washington. Last year they beat him. I think this year it's a little bit different. I think they don't have the same offensive firepower early on. This is also a Thursday game, so really early in the season here. I think that's a loss. And I think if they played them later in the season, that easily could be a dub. But right now, this offense does worry me outside of their running back, Ethan Mangrum. So we'll see what happens. Ponderosa, I think that's a loss. Montrose, that's listed on here. That's a loss. Then they play Doherty. Doherty has some size, I think, to, fend against the size that Falcon has. That actually could be pretty close if their defense could step up there, because Doherty's offense is losing some. But I don't know. We'll see. I think that could really go either way. I'm going to give it to Doherty for now because it is at Gary Berry Stadium. And it's not like it's super far from Falcon, but I'm going to give it to them for now. It's a slight edge, but don't get it twisted. This is pretty much a toss-up right there. Then they play Pueblo West. I don't think they're going to beat them. That's a loss. And then Mesa Ridge is also a loss. The other team in this conference is Widefield, and I think they'll beat Widefield. So there you go there. And so their predicted record here with what I have is 1-7. That is 8 games, which is the minimum amount of games you got to play in a season. So it is realistic that they could go 1-7 here. But I will give them a window of wins anywhere between 0 and 4. I think, I'm looking at the schedule here, right? Widefield, they should beat Widefield. I'd be really surprised if they lost that one and won winless. Looking at some other games they could potentially win, Doherty, I think that is another game that could be their win for sure, And then, they do have room to schedule only 2 more games, and so that's already 2 wins. Say they win those 2 games that haven't been scheduled yet, that'd put them at 4 wins, so that's pretty solid there. But, just looking at the rest of the schedule, G-Dub, I think, is going to be really good this next year. Last year was a little bit of a down year, but they return a really good quarterback, a good backfield. I think Falcons' defense, if they could keep it close, that gives them a good chance at winning. But I don't know. You still got to score points, and your defense, you can't just rely on a defense to score every single game for you to win. That's just not like a good idea in general. And so, unfortunately, I think that's probably a loss. I think there's a world where maybe they beat him, and so maybe that pushes that wow to 5. But I think for now, I'm just going to keep it safe at 0 and 4. They play just a lot of tough teams. Ponderosa, Montrose, Pueblo West, Mesa Ridge. Those are all guaranteed playoff teams. And not like low-seeded playoff teams either. They're good playoff teams, right? You have Doherty, who I think is on the cusp. Maybe they make it, maybe they don't. We'll see what happens there, but that's also a good team as well. I think if they want to make the playoffs, they got to win against Doherty and then whatever other games that they schedule as well. And actually, now that I think about it, they're also going to play Vista Ridge here. So actually, their predicted record now goes to 1-8 because I don't think they're beating Vista Ridge. They've never beat him. And to make things worse, they also get arguably their best player too. So I just don't love that for Falcons' chances at winning. So they're in a tough spot here. You know, predicted record 1-8, window of wins 0-4 here, but they have a linebacker in Jaden Brewster, who I think if you haven't seen yet, you got to watch him play. He's a great player. And then they got a solid defense, some young players who are coming up. I think Guerrero is going to be a senior, though. But Ashton Massey, Jacob Hunter, Brody Mitz, Alex Griswold, I mean, that's kind of a squad. I'm not going to lie. And, you know, they're going to have some guys to build on going into next season for sure. And so it's not like you shouldn't just not watch Falcon because they're not winning, but they are playing some really tough teams here. This is a pretty difficult schedule in my opinion, and I mean, I don't know, I think it really just boils down to the lack of firepower they have on offense. It is extremely difficult to just replace 2,000 yards of offense and Carter Thorpe alone, 700 passing yards, 1,300 rushing yards, so that's tough. You know, that alone is a lot to replace. So then you just add on McFarland, who's a 584 rushing yards there. Latrell, 221, plus Latrell's 317, so that's 500 as well. That's another 1,000 yards. So you're having to replace 3,000, at least, rushing yards on offense. Not just rushing yards, 3,000 offensive yards on offense. It's a tall order, and I don't think that it's very fair to just be like, yeah, Falcons going to figure it out. I think for any team, that's a really tall order to replace that many yards of offense. And so, unfortunately, I think it's going to be kind of a down year for them after their playoff appearance last year. But we'll see. I think they have a lot of young talent, and I think that's definitely worth seeing at least once this season. So there you go there. That is Falcon. Okay, let's talk about Liberty. I predicted them going 7-3 with a window of wins of 6-8, and they had a disappointing season going 4-6, which was 2 games below the window of wins I had them in, which is just kind of weird. I don't know why they regressed so bad here, as they played basically the same schedule, but it started out with a disappointing 21-7 loss over Air Academy, which I really thought they should have won, especially when Air Academy did have Baruch Johnson after. That was just strange. Then they lost to Canyon City 23-12, which was one I thought they could win. And then it just kind of continues. They lose to Sierra 20-3. Just 3 really bad losses to start the season. Then they get back on track. They beat Gateway 17-6, just kind of barely there. Beat Hinckley 52-0, Palmer 39-31, and kind of a close one. Would lose to Centaurus, who, I mean, just blew them out 36-6. Part of it was because Centaurus, I didn't think that their quarterback would take as big a step forward, but, you know, on top of that, also Liberty's team just regressed in general, so that's just kind of a tough loss. They'd also lose to TJ. They'd beat Thornton 49-0 before losing to Widefield 30-14. I felt like this senior team really, or a lot of the seniors on this team, just really underperformed and just did not do a great job here. Now, they do graduate a lot of key seniors who were key to the run 2 years ago, as when they were all juniors, but, you know, they are losing some good players here, including Elijah Rupeshko, I want to say. He's their senior quarterback, passed for 1,292 yards, 11 touchdowns, 8 picks, also ran for 244 yards and 7 touchdowns. I thought he was going to be better. He was just really inefficient, 39 completion percentage, which is a lot lower than where he was at before, I feel, so that's tough. Chris Hunter had a pretty down year as well. He went from having a 1,300 rushing, like junior rushing yard performance to 676. Didn't miss any games either, only had 6 touchdowns, so that's a tough one. But he's been the engine to this defense for a long while. So that's a tough loss, losing your top 2 leading rushers there. They also lose Jackson Hunt, who was their lead receiver in touchdowns, had 210 receiving yards and 14 receptions and 5 touchdowns there. So that's kind of a tough one to lose as well. He was also their interception leader on defense with 4. On defense, by the way, lose 6 of their top 13 tacklers. So not the worst, honestly. They only lose 1 of their top 5 tacklers in Chris Hunter, but they do lose their sack leader in Zulowski, who had 6, and they lose 2 players who were second in sacks here, and Sand and Lockermeyer, who each had 3. So tough go there, but the defense not losing too much there. A lot of their losses are on offense, but let's talk about the players returning. Lucas Westerman will be an incoming senior. He was one of their lead tacklers last year, once more with 78 tackles and 3 forced fumbles. He's their second leading tackler as a junior. Entering his senior year, he could potentially see some carries on offense against Widefield. He ran for 73 yards on 12 carries. I think that would definitely be somebody that you welcome to the backfield just to get some production over there. Honestly, I think that would be a good fit. Plus, Westerman, he's been a big part of this team for going into his 4th year now. Started as a freshman, and I think you should reward some of that if you're Liberty. That's just my opinion, though. But, he's going to be one of the first players that we've covered all 4 years. So there you go there. They also bring back their tackle leader in William Heiser, I want to say. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, but he's their lead tackler with 101 tackles. Him and Westerman should be a pretty nice duo. They bring back their lead receiver in yards in Jackson Miller, who had 252 yards on 20 receptions, also had 54 tackles and a pick on defense. There's a good chance that they build around him as far as offensive talent and focal points go. We'll see what happens there. They also have a defensive tackle here in Alex Tran, 6'1", 270, who had 42 tackles last season, was a big part of that defense there. He will be a senior this season, and so that does add some nice size. They also bring back Tristan Dosh here, who was an undersized DT at 6', 200, but had 49 tackles and 6 tackles for loss. And so this defense is going to have to put in some work going into next year, as they are losing just so much production on the offensive side of the ball. But let's get to the predictions here. I just think it's gonna be a tough year. They play Doherty. I think that's a loss. Widefield, I think that's a closer, potentially they beat them. Maybe they're also losing some players, but they lost to them last year too. We'll see. I think that's a toss-up, but I kind of give the edge to Widefield here. We'll see what happens. They play Denver East. That's definitely a loss. That's a 5A team and potentially a contender in 5A. Don't know why that was scheduled on Liberty's end, but that's not a winnable game in any sense of the word. They then play Palmer. I think this is maybe another closer game, but I think it's also a loss, just being straight up honest. They actually returned some talent on the offensive side of the ball, despite having a new coaching staff. So I just feel really nervous about that game if I'm Liberty. Their defense would have to play really well. Rangeview, that's another 5A team. I think that's a loss. Not the greatest 5A team. There's been 3A teams who have beat Rangeview, but I do think they have some talent over there, some size. I just don't love the matchup there, so I'm going to give it to Rangeview. And then they play Vista Ridge, Air Academy, Rampart, Durango, Palmer Ridge. I think those are all losses, honestly. So there you go. I have them going 0-10, just straight up, with a window of wins of 0-3. Their winnable games are Widefield, Palmer, and Rangeview. Yeah, I would say I thought about Durango and Air Academy, but I just don't think there's any way that they lose to any of those teams here. So really, those are their 3 winnable games, because they play a much more difficult schedule than last year. Last year's schedule was definitely more beneficial and probably a lot closer to where they are talent-wise. They probably should have stayed in the I-25 league. And I just think they're playing a lot of playoff teams. They're in a league with almost all playoff teams. That tough SoCo 2 league with Vista Ridge, Air Academy, Rampart, Durango, and Palmer Ridge. That's an extremely difficult league, in general. And on top of that, they're just not like that. And so I have them going 0-10, window of wins between 0 and 3. They're going to have to rely on their defense, and they got to figure something out on offense. I don't know what will happen. Even when they had an offense last year, they lost. And so I'm just not super high on them this season for good reason. So we'll see what happens. But there you go. That's Liberty's season preview. All right, now moving on, let's go ahead and talk about Vista Ridge here. So last year was their first year in a post-Dorman and Hills era, and I predicted them to still go 7-3 with a window of wins between 5 and 8. I felt like it was pretty generous, but for good reason, and they actually went 6-4 in the regular season, so not bad, just below where I predicted them, but definitely in the window of wins that I had for them. And most of their season went as predicted. Lost to Legend, beat Far Northeast, lost to Pine Creek, beat Falcon, beat Vista Peak, beat Northfield, which was an overtime game. A little bit closer than I probably thought it would be, but not completely surprising. The year before, I thought that was, it was a close game, right? So there you go there. They would go ahead and beat Air Academy. They beat Cheyenne Mountain, albeit it was kind of close, 42-32, but they still beat them. That was also in their stretch of games without Zayden Stevens, so Ben Noblet played that Air Academy and Cheyenne Mountain game, I want to say. So there you go there. And then they play Rampart. This was a game that I thought that they would win, and they lost kind of shockingly, 35-19. They had Zayden Stevens, so there's no excuse for that, but it is what it is. Then they went on and lost to Palmer Ridge 51-0 to end the regular season, so it all pretty much went as expected except for the Rampart game, which is definitely a little bit of a red flag moving forward, which we'll talk about later. They will then go play Denver South in the first round in a thriller here, and unfortunately just lose 27-26 in a tough one. Now, they do lose a couple players here, but I'm going to start with their head coach. Their head coach is gone. Verana, that is. He is gone, and so they brought in a new head coach, which we'll talk about later, but that does have some implications here. They graduate these players, though. They graduate Sonny Endicott, who is their senior receiver, their lead receiver, who had 32 receptions for 724 yards and 8 touchdowns. As expected, he took on a bigger role and did a really good job for that team, so he's gone. They lose their lead tackler on defense, Kenneth Bernard, who had 58 total tackles, so he's out of there. Ethan Ainsworth only played 3 games, which is a shame because he had 3 sacks against Legend. He's gone, but he had 4, which led the team, so that's tough. They lose their number 1 corner, Wesley Wright, who had 27 tackles, 4 picks, and 9 pass deflections, and altogether lose 8 of their top 13 tacklers, but are only graduating 2 of their top 5 tacklers in Bernard and Larson, who Bernard was their lead tackler, obviously. Larson was their 5th overall. So they do return a solid amount of defenders, but it does not end there. And actually, they graduate that many, 8 of their top 13, but they actually also lose a player to transfer here. That's Cam Turtalian, as he had 41 tackles and was tied for that sack leader spot with 4 here. The sophomore linebacker for them, he has transferred out to Mesa Ridge. They also lose Kobe Dooley, who has also transferred to Mesa Ridge. He was their second leading receiver with 525 yards and 4 touchdowns on 31 receptions. His dad is now a coach over at Mesa Ridge, which is a big pull for them. And we'll talk about Mesa Ridge later on in this episode, but he will now be over there. They also lose Isaac Walker to Pine Creek. Interesting enough there, as he was their 3rd leading receiver with 273 yards and 2 touchdowns. So their top 3 receivers are now gone, along with Turtalian. That's 9 of their top 13 tacklers as well. They also lose their backup quarterback, Ben Noblet, who in the place for Zayden Stevens was pretty efficient, arguably better, throwing for 5 touchdowns to 1 pick and 287 yards in 2 games. He has moved back to Palmer Ridge, and so we'll talk about him more when we talk about Palmer Ridge. And so that's a tough go for Vista Ridge, who's just losing a lot here. But their new head coach is Matt Weebles here, a former defensive coordinator for Pine Creek. And a lot of Pine Creek coaches actually coming over to Vista Ridge. And there's a deeper story. They're over at Pine Creek. It's not I feel like... How should I approach this? I feel like I want to talk about that story more when we talk about Pine Creek here. And there's a lot of allegedlys and stuff like that. So we'll get there when we get there. But we'll save that for Pine Creek's season preview here next week. But let's talk about some of these key players, right? They bring back Zayden Stevens, their starting quarterback, watch list quarterback, threw for 1,512 yards, 15 touchdowns and 10 picks, rushed for 186 yards and 5 touchdowns. While it wasn't a bad season, I mean, it could have been better. He was hurt for a couple games as well, and I think going into this year, I mean, he loses his top 3 receivers, which is a pretty tough spot to be in for them. And so we'll kind of see what happens here. He's going to have to prove, he's going to be playing without a lot of those top receivers for the first time in his career. And so we'll see what he could do with what he has going into his senior year, but at least they return him, right? They also returned their starting running back in Nashawn Hall. He had a solid year, rushing for 652 yards, 2 touchdowns, not 2 touchdowns, 6 touchdowns. He had 2 runs of over 100 plus, it looks like here. But he had some key games against Air Academy, 179 yards, 3 touchdowns. Cheyenne Mountain, 179 and a touchdown. Denver South, he had 88 rushing yards, 3 receptions, 39 yards, and a receiving touchdown. So it's fair to assume they'll lean on him. They also have a running back coming in, and Gabriel McFarland here. Gabe McFarland from Falcon, who is going to be able to contribute a lot and, help fill some of those voids. He ran for 108 yards on Montrose and a touchdown. Also ran for 150 and 2 on Air Academy here. And then against Fruita Monument in that playoff game, only had 7 carries, but 1 for 48 yards and a touchdown. He's a talented back to add to this team. He also plays some defense. He's 6'1", 208 pounds, so that's definitely a good defender to bring in. And another option on offense, I think most importantly there, to go with Nashawn Hall and Zayden Stevens, all entering their senior year, by the way. Then this defense, they have a nice young core led by incoming senior safety Mason Carter and incoming junior safety JB Borland, who had a pretty good year. That group, that duo of safeties, Carter had 47 tackles, Borland had 41 there. Borland had 5 picks, Carter had 1 pick. It's a good group of safeties to bring back and kind of build your team around. You have other players like Putnam, who's also returning on that defense. So you got some players, not a lot, but you at least have 2 good safeties there, which I think you should feel really good about, honestly. And then, adding the DC's, defensive coordinator from Pine Creek as your head coach, and some other coaches from Pine Creek as well. I think this defense could really develop too, so I'm not too worried about them. They also have Jameer Ford, who's going to be an incoming senior. I think he's a bit of a wild card. He was a very productive corner at Thomas Jefferson as an underclassman before moving to Vista Ridge, and I think he's going to get more looks. He's going to have to get more looks as a receiver and get more playing time here at DB and be relied on a lot more as they are losing so much. And so all together, Vista Ridge has some players. They lost some players. They brought in some players. They lost some coaches. They brought in some coaches. Let's go ahead and predict this record, which I think will be tough to do. But to start, they play Montbello here. The return of Montbello varsity football. That's their first game on August 30th, 6 p.m. up in Denver. They play at Montbello, that is. And I think they should beat them. That should be a pretty talented group, honestly, but I think playing them early on, getting them early, that's going to be good. That's definitely going to be good for them. Then they play a team from Wyoming in Evanston who went 5-5 last year. Sorry, 5-6 last year. Just not a very good team. They really should beat them. Then they play Denver South. Won't have another quarterback over there again. This could potentially be a close one, but I think I'm going to give them the edge. I like the backfield that Vista Ridge has. I think they're in a good spot there. Then they play Columbine. That's a loss. I don't think they have the defensive capabilities to stop that team right now. And if they do, you got to prove me wrong. They play Pueblo West. That's another loss. Same thing. Defense, I think, is going to be an issue. They'll beat Liberty after that, though. They play Rampart. That should be a really close game. But Rampart did beat them last year. I'm going to give Rampart the edge here. But that's going to be a close one. They play Palmer Ridge as well after Rampart in Monument. I think that's going to be another close game. But I'm going to give it to Palmer Ridge right now. Wouldn't be surprised if they won it. So there you go. There's 2 games right there that I think are toss-ups. Then they play Air Academy and Durango, and both of those should be wins. So as of right now, I have them going 6-4 with a window of wins between 5 to 8. I mean, that Rampart and Palmer Ridge game, I think those are 2 toss-up games that I'm marking as losses, but I think they could definitely win those as well. Other than that, there's a lot of games here that I think they should win. Air Academy, Durango, Liberty, those should all be wins there. Evanston as well, that should be a win there. And so, actually, I'm going to make their window of wins 4 to 8. So, at the very least, they should definitely win at least 4 games this season. Now, any other games they win after that, that's going to contribute to them making the playoffs, because I do think they can still make the playoffs. Montbello, like I said, I really feel like that should be a dub, but I don't know. They got some talent. They're a little bit of an unknown. We'll see what happens there, honestly. And then Denver South, I guess that could be considered a toss-up, but I really do like Vista Ridge in that one. Pueblo West, I think any other year, maybe I'd feel better about them, but I just have a lot of worries about, how much this defense could truly stop, and also how much this offense could score as well. So we'll see what happens there. But altogether, it should be a very interesting season for Vista Ridge. I think they still make the playoffs. I really do. They got a lot of talent here. Their backfield's very good. Arguably one of the best backfields in the entire Springs, right? But the losses of the defense, the loss of the receiving core, plus, their OC over there as well, I believe, and Dooley, those are things that you can't ignore. And just so many transfers as well. It's pretty unusual to have this many transfers out, but I guess it is what it is, right? And so we'll see what happens with Vista Ridge moving forward. Like I said, a playoff team, but I think their floor... I don't know. I think their floor is obvious, but their ceiling is definitely a little dubious there. We'll see what happens this season. All right, now next we are going to talk about Mesa Ridge here. Last year, I actually predicted them to go 7-2 here, 8-2 if they replace the extra Rampart game. I think there was a mistake on their schedule where they had Rampart scheduled twice, which was kind of weird. So I had them going 7-2, but 8-2, just assuming they would probably win that extra game with the window of wins between 6 and 9. And they actually went 7-3 here, right in that ballpark. And so they would actually end up playing Kennedy. That would be the team they play at the beginning of the season to replace that extra game. And that was a pretty easy dub, which they won 57-0. But then they played Palmer Ridge, and I thought this would be a game they would win. And I went to this one, so I saw it live. But it was a very impressive 43-20 win by Palmer Ridge, who, just got out to a hot start, and Mesa Ridge just couldn't quite dig themselves out of that tough spot. So there you go there. Then they played Dakota Ridge. I predicted that one as a close loss, and it was. They lost 39-35 at home, which is tough. But then they bounced back with a couple wins in a row here, beating Doherty 28-0, Widefield 66-14. Jeez, that's a lot. Pueblo West, they won a close one over there, 36-34. Then they beat Coronado 69-6, beat Rampart pretty convincingly here, 47-21, before going to Montrose and dropping a tough one, 43-12. I mean, that was as predicted. I knew that would be a tough game. And then ending the season with a dub over Falcon. And so all that was good enough to actually get them a first-round bye in the playoffs, where they would pull Loveland, which is a very tough team, and they absolutely destroyed them by 57-7 in a little bit of a statement win at home. Just a huge playoff win for them against a Loveland team who is usually pretty good, like in general in these playoffs, and good against the run, which is what Mesa Ridge likes to do. So just kind of a crazy game there. Before going to the quarterfinals and losing to Broomfield 38-6, a little bit of an uncharacteristic win there, or loss there, but it is what it is. Still a pretty good season for Mesa Ridge. Now, a couple departures. They are losing some key talents here, including Isaiah Jones, who has been such a great player for them these last 3 years. But in his last season, he had a career one, going for 1,315 rushing yards and 22 rushing touchdowns, also catching 19 receptions for 282 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns on offense. And on defense at linebacker, he was also big time, providing 73 tackles, 2 sacks, 3 pass deflections, kind of as the MVP of the squad, and I think he'll go down as one of the greatest Mesa Ridge football players of all time, just being able to do it both ways. He was the second leading tackler and the leading rusher for the squad, not to mention third leading receiver, as he was just big time, just an absolute workhorse, the definition of it. So there you go there. On top of that, they do lose 2 other receivers in Avent Wright and Tanner Whittick, their top 2 receivers actually. Wright, 307 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 20 receptions. Tanner Whittick, 17 receptions for 301 yards and a touchdown. Those guys were pretty reliable there, so that's a tough loss. They also graduate Chance Morin-Weiser, who was a key guard for them up front and a captain of that team, so that's a tough loss. They graduate Tevin Reel as well. Contributed on offense, but I think is more known on the defensive side at safety. We had 49 tackles and a team high 6 interceptions, and he was big time in that Palmer Ridge game, by the way. And, they're losing a pretty good majority of their defense, actually. 10 of their top 13 tacklers. That means only 3 tacklers are returning. That were big time for them. Luckily for them, 3 of them are in their top 5, while the rest are seniors. But let's go ahead and talk about the key players going into this next season before we talk about that defense. And let's start with our quarterback, Bryce Reel. The incoming senior had a slightly down junior year here, just rushing more rather than passing, but still had a good year. He passed for 1,755 passing yards, 18 touchdowns, only 8 picks, while rushing for 391 yards and 9 touchdowns. With Jones gone, he's going to have to take on a bigger workload. And I think it could actually work out even with his top receivers graduating. I mean, Bryce Reel, he's a great athlete over there, could throw the ball, could run it. He could definitely win you a state championship. I'm just throwing that out there. On top of that, they're going to bring back a incoming junior running back in Trayvon Salas, but he has been playing since his freshman year, and in his sophomore year, he rushed for 865 yards and 7 touchdowns as a second option, arguably third option if you include Bryce Reel in that backfield. But, not before capping off a 19-carry, 168-yard, 1 touchdown performance against a Loveland team who is very good. And so he should be the primary ball carrier these next 2 years as the offense lean on him a little bit more. And, he's not the same power runner as Isaiah Jones, but he has a little bit more finesse. And I think that's still pretty good if you're Mesa Ridge. You're happy with that. Now, real quick, switching over. Let's stay on the offensive side of the ball for a minute here, and let's talk about Sonny Rogers, the 6'3", a pretty skinny, but a 6'3" incoming senior receiver. Literally only had 7 receptions, but went for 226 yards and 3 touchdowns. Those are really good stats for the limited time he had there. He was their 4th receiver here, only 7 receptions in 7 games. If he could stay healthy, he could definitely be a number 1 option for them as far as receiving goes. And speaking of receiving, they also bring back Xander Iwanski, their 6'3", 240-pound fullback / tight end who low-key was a security blanket for Bryce Real last year. Him returning, I think, is going to be huge, as he will have a little bit of a bigger role. He could definitely catch the ball, but he's an excellent blocker as well. I think on the next level, he could be a perfect fullback or tight end option. A little bit shorter for a tight end, but still a very reliable option on this level of football here, and somebody that could help replace some of that receiving production and rushing production that they are losing. And then on top of that, to talk about the Mesa Ridge line, they should be pretty decent. They do lose Moore and Weiser, which is tough, right? But they bring back some great players, including a big-time 6'3", 280-pound incoming junior guard, DeAndre Green, who has really good film and could potentially fill out and be a nice offensive tackle as well if he grows a little bit more. But he's going to be a key part of this offensive line. On top of that, they also return Slater Warren, who was their left tackle last year, and he will be a senior. So you have two pretty good pieces to work with. I really like Green's potential, though, and he could take this team to the next level. So there you go there. Now defensively, they got some players. Levi Tesson, I want to say. He's an undersized incoming junior linebacker, but he had 106 total tackles and 10.5 tackles for loss last season, and was their leader in tackles. So he's going to be returning. They also return Anthony Smith, probably one of the fastest players in the state. He plays DB safety, I want to say, and they also return Caleb Chico as well, who are some other quality players. Like I said, all these players were top 5 defenders. Tesson here, he's going to be a senior. He had 106 tackles last year. Chico will be a senior, had 71 tackles, and then Smith will also be a senior right behind Chico. He had 68 tackles, and so they got some speed and some consistency at least, returning some of the leaders of this defense, which I think is absolutely huge for them. Now, Mesa Ridge will also have a couple transfers. They do add a coach, and Coach Dooley, who I think is one of the best coaches in the entire state, a great wide receiver coach, OC coach. And so I think this offensive attack and passing game is really going to go to the next level with Coach Dooley over there coaching them up. And so I'm really excited for that. But he also brings his son Kobe Dooley over, who will be an incoming junior. He's one of the most electric receivers in the state with elite speed. Just got his first offer from CSU, despite being an undersized receiver too, by the way. And they're all coming over from Vista Ridge here. And so that adds a really nice receiving option for Bryce Real, arguably the best receiving option, or one of the best receiving options he ever had in his career, next to the Cheeks brothers, or brother, who's now currently at Northern Colorado. And so adding a Kobe Dooley, I think, gives you a legit wideout one option if you didn't feel like you already had one, and that's absolutely huge. Plus in the return game, I mean, you're going to have to kick away from him, but he adds a lot of speed, some elite speed, like speed that could take off the top of a defense to an already explosive offense who has a dominant rushing attack and a pretty solid passing attack as is. And so adding him is going to be big time. On top of that, they add incoming junior linebacker / running back Cam Tertullian from Vista Ridge as well, where he was one of their top tacklers with 41 and was a co-sack leader with 4. He's a tough linebacker. I think you just add another thumper over the middle, and that's going to be absolutely big time. On top of that, I think he could be a really nice running mate with Trayvon Salas as well, as he was a solid running back in his middle school, younger days, right? And I think you could definitely tap back into that and have him replace some of those Isaiah Jones rushing yards. And so with all of that being said, man, Mesa Ridge is stacked on offense. They are going to be extremely dangerous, and defensively, I mean, they return the right amount of players to be really tough over there as well. You know, they got some good tacklers. They have a defense you could definitely work with over there, so it won't be too bad. So with that being said, let's hop into these predictions here, starting with Air Academy and Northfield. I think both of those are pretty easy dubs there. They take care of business, gel a little bit more, and that'll get them ready for relatively tough matchup with Dakota Ridge, which they're playing away, and I think Dakota Ridge, I mean, they do lose their head coach, they lose their quarterback too, which I think is a big deal. Dakota Ridge is still going to be tough, but I like Mesa Ridge more, especially considering it was such a close game last year. Mesa Ridge returns arguably a little bit more than Dakota Ridge and has a little bit more firepower too. I think I'm going to have to go with Mesa Ridge in this one, even though that will be a tough one. Then they play Heritage at home. I think that's a dub. I think it could definitely potentially be close, but I'm going to lean towards Mesa Ridge here, especially since they have home field advantage. Following that, they play away at Palmer Ridge. They should win that game. I know it's away, but they have enough firepower to beat that team. The only way they lose is if they beat themselves, honestly. So I gotta go with Mesa Ridge in that one. But, you know, you can never really count out Palmer Ridge, though. So just throwing that out there. But I really think they should beat him. Now, after that, they play Widefield. That's a dub. They play Pueblo West. I think that's a dub as well. That was a close game last year. I think it can be this year. But I still like Mesa Ridge and what they have over there firepower-wise. I think Pueblo West, they might find themselves in some tough mismatches over there. And then offensively, I don't know if they could keep up from there. But we'll see what happens. Then they play Montrose. I feel like this is a game they can win, but their defense has to be good. And so I'm just going to say their offense outshoots Montrose's offense. A couple years ago, they got into a little shootout in Mesa Ridge, by the way, at home. And that was a fun game. I think it could be very similar to that. But I think Mesa Ridge definitely returns more firepower than Montrose, especially considering Montrose does graduate a lot of their defense, a couple of their key running backs as well, which makes me really nervous about that matchup. But, you know, who knows? Maybe they do figure it out. We'll talk about Montrose here later on in the episode too, by the way, so just stay tuned for that. Moving on, they play Doherty, that's a dub, and Falcon as well. Those are all dubs. And so all together, this might sound wild, but predicted record-wise, I have Mesa Ridge going undefeated, a perfect 10-0, with a window of wins between 7 and 10. I think if I had to pick games that they would lose, Heritage, Palmer Ridge, Montrose, and Pueblo West, I think are all games that they could potentially lose. Now, I don't think they're going to lose all four. I'd be really surprised if they lost all four here. They should at least win one of those four, and so that's why I have their window of wins at 7. But I think there's a good chance that Mesa Ridge just has an excellent season here and goes undefeated and makes the playoffs again as a top seed. Obviously, losing in Isaiah Jones and a Weiser and Tevin Wright and your receivers are tough. But you do bring in a Kobe Dooley and a Cam Turtle-Leon who will help replace some of that. And then you just got to ask a little bit more from some of these other players who have already showed potential, like a Sonny Rogers, like a Xander Iwanski as well. And, I mean, this team, just I'm looking at it schematically and all the different things they could do. They could have a lot of mismatches for a lot of teams. I don't know if there are many defenses in the state that match up great with Mesa Ridge, assuming that, you know, they call all the right plays, of course. And that says a lot, you know, because 4A, I think you have a lot of very good teams. And so I will just say this, my biggest concern is this defense. They do lose a lot, but historically, they have done a good job at reloading at some of those positions and replacing some of those players and getting arguably more productive players. They develop their players really well over there, which I absolutely love. And I think they can replace some of that talent, but they do return like just enough. It's not like they're losing everybody and they're returning like 3 guys who had minimal impacts. Like, no, the 3 guys they replace, or the 3 guys, that they bring back have a lot of playing time from last year. And I feel really good about them building around that, as well as adding a Cam Turtle-Leon and a Kobe Dooley, who I think could also play defense if he wanted to as well. And that could be scary. And I mean, they have the right guys in the right spots for that defense to be just good enough for them to make a run here at the playoffs. And honestly, I think they're a contender. I think they're a team that realistically could win state this season. I think this is as good a chance as any, and their window is definitely still open. So I'm excited to see Mesa Ridge play this year. Definitely looking forward to watching them play a couple of times, hopefully this season, as I think it's gonna be fireworks over there. It's gonna be a good time, and so we'll see what happens. But excited for Mesa Ridge's season. All right, up next is Palmer Ridge, and I was straight up wrong about this team. Despite not even having a bad prediction, I had them going 7-3 with a window of wins of 5-8, and that is knowing that they are gonna walk out there with a new head coach in Zach Carlton, who was their former defensive coordinator. And they overachieved. They played great. Went a perfect 10-0, and by the way, I mean, this is one I was just wrong about, as they were 2 games over my window of wins, but went 10-0, and this is where it all started. It started with a tough and gritty 28-27 win over Montrose. Wins over Montrose are tough, honestly, just straight up. And so you take him where you could get him, and I think to get a win that early gave them a lot of confidence there. Then they would go play a pretty good Mesa Ridge team who I thought they would lose to away. But, they just came out to a faster start and looked really dominant to start there. And I was at that game, but that's when I knew that this Palmer Ridge team could make a deep playoff run if they wanted. And so then from there, rattled off wins against Lewis Palmer, Smoky Hill, which weren't close, beat Ponderosa 34-12. I thought that might be a closer one, but Max Mervin was at quarterback as they were dealing with injuries, and so Palmer Ridge just won up pretty easily there. And then the rest of their games they won 42-0 against Rampart, 42-7 Pueblo West, 55-0 Air Academy, 54-7 Cheyenne Mountain, 51-0 Vista Ridge over there. And then they would go on here in the playoffs with a bye. I want to say they were the number 1 seed in the playoffs here, or at least I felt like they should have been the number 1 seed as the only undefeated team. But they played Denver South. That wasn't close, beat them 42-6. Played Heritage, beat him 28-7. Played Broomfield in the snow. That wasn't close at all, 38-14. Before playing Erie in-state up at Fort Collins over at CSU Stadium, and just came up short to Erie 20-6. Wasn't at the game, but I was able to re-watch the whole thing and replay some moments. I just felt like they got going on offense way too late. Defensively, it wasn't even a bad scheme against a Blake Barnett, who was like an MVP. I mean, he won MVP and was a top 5 quarterback and safety for us. I mean, that's a very good Erie squad led by Barnett over there, and they held them to like only 2 scores pretty much, I think, going into that 4th quarter, and they just couldn't get it going on offense. They just sputtered out too much, and I also thought they were a little conservative with their play calling, which is tough. But with all that being said, I feel like they really overachieved with the team that they had this year. In the first year for Coach Zach Carlton, got to give him a lot of credit. I think he was a Coach of the Year candidate if he wasn't a Coach of the Year winner. Let me check actually real quick. Yes, he did win Coach of the Year in his first year as a coach, going 13-1, by the way, which is absolutely impressive. I mean, a lot of props to him, but I mean, this was also a good team that had a lot of players who played together for a while. And so let's talk about some of those players, starting with their quarterback, Derek Hester, a 3-year varsity starter. Not gonna lie, I had my doubts about him early on, but I think in the system that they played him in this year, it fit all his strengths, and he really played the system well. Threw for 1,688 yards, 22 touchdowns, only 9 picks. Also rushed for 1,040 yards and 18 touchdowns. I want to say the only quarterback in the state to pass for over 1,520 touchdowns and also rush for 1,018. And maybe Blake Barnett is up there too, but Derek Hester, I mean, just very consistent, and he did a good job for this Palmer Ridge team. Then you have players like Jimmer Weir, who had a breakout season his senior year, going for 948 receiving yards, 18 receiving touchdowns on 48 receptions as their number 1 receiver, while also having 65 tackles and leading with picks with 7. He was actually an MVP candidate for us last season and got votes as well. And honestly, that's just incredible, for someone who didn't do too much before. For him to just have a breakout season like that, that's big time. They're also losing TJ Mabe offensively. He was the security blanket for Hester. bringing in, a solid 15 receptions, 260 yards, and a touchdown. On defense, he was a force at defensive end with 73 tackles, 15 tackles for loss, and 5.5 sacks there. Speaking of a force on both sides of the ball, we also have Holden Wright, who was a top 5 senior linebacker for us in general, now at Northern Colorado. But offensively, he was their power back who contributed 560, which is a lot, rushing yards, 550 rushing yards and 12 rushing touchdown on only 80 carries, averaging around 7 yards a carry there. While on defense, he was their lead tackler with 108 tackles, 19 tackles for loss, and then tied Mabe with 5.5 sacks, while also having 2 interceptions. And while he didn't make our all-PMC list, I mean, he was a great player for them all season long and was big time for them, and that versatility is just, it's tough to replace. It just is. Having someone at that size with that athleticism, that's just a tough one to replace. By the way, Derek Hester, Jimmer Weir, and I want to say that's pretty much it. Oh, Rhett Armstrong as well, but he'll be returning. They were all PMC players this last season, getting recognition there. So shout out to them. Now, they are also graduating, before I move on, they're also graduating 11 of their top 13 tacklers, which also includes 8 of their top tacklers. So they're going to have to rebuild this defense as well as the offense. I mean, it's a lot of players to lose going into next season, but last year I thought that they weren't going to be as good with all the players they lost. Maybe they could turn it around quickly here as well, as they do return some solid players. They return Elvira, incoming senior running back, who had a solid productive year, running for 844 yards and 7 touchdowns, averaging 7.7 yards a carry, by the way. He was their second leading rusher for them over there, and I think this season he's going to have to be some sort of workhorse for them to find some good productivity on the offensive side of the ball. And helping him out, he's going to have Court Towns, the 6'4", 295-pound offensive lineman for them, who was an all-PMC offensive lineman last year, and I want to say the year before as well. He's tough, he's tough. I think he might also play defense as well. As of the 31st of May, only offered by Navy and Air Force, but expect more to come potentially if he doesn't commit already, as he's just an absolute monster on both sides of the ball, a very physical offensive lineman that holds up the great tradition that they have over at Palmer Ridge. They also return Owen Twesme. He's a 6'2", 290-pound offensive tackle here. Moves really well and is a key part of that offensive line, or was a key part of that offensive line last year for them, and will only be a junior next year, which is big time for sure. It's definitely big time, I think he could grow a little bit more, and he could definitely kick in. That might be where his strength is, but he's a solid starter for them that will be returning for them. Now, they also have a couple transfers, but I'm going to talk about them at the end. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. They returned Carson Campbell, one of the lone returners of the defense at safety. Made some solid contributions. As an incoming senior, he's going to be relied on to help lead a very inexperienced defense, but maybe he also competes for the quarterback spot as a wildcat option. We'll see there. Got some snaps there. They also return an incoming senior receiver, and I think it's Zakai or Ziki Wacker. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong. I'm going to go with Zakai, though. But he made some big plays at state and throughout the season. He was their number 2 receiver in a run-first offense. He had 262 yards, a touchdown, and 13 receptions. With Weir and Mabe gone, I think he could have a Jimmer Weir type breakout season for them, and he made some big plays in that Erie game. It was very memorable, and so one's got to wonder, can some of that momentum go into this next season, his senior year, and I think it can. So we'll see what happens there. Now, Palmer Ridge, they do get a couple transfers. This is as of June 21st. So if anybody else transfers, I'm just not going to catch it, and it won't be part of my predictions here. But they get DeMarcus Holt, a big lineman from Vista Ridge. I think he's around 6'2", 300 type-ish, and he's been dominant. I think there's a good chance that he could get in there and potentially compete for a starting spot on that offensive line or some sort of contribution. On top of that, they have a whole bunch of other linemen in the wings as well, who I think could be really interesting. And so Palmer Ridge's offensive line will definitely not be a problem going into next season. I don't think so, at least. And then on top of that, I think this is a pretty big transfer, but they get Ben Noblet back. And you got to remember, he started at Palmer Ridge, and then these last 2 years, backed up Braden Dorman, learned a lot from Braden Dorman, and then unfortunately backed up Zayden Stevens, lost that job, but he did get to play in 2 games where Zayden Stevens was hurt, and he won both of those games, throwing for 5 touchdowns and only 1 pick in both of those games. And so he's coming back for his senior year. I don't think he's going to have to sit. I think he could be a really good stopgap quarterback for them if they decide to go that route, because he does know this offense pretty well, or he can learn it at least. I mean, he learned Vista Ridge's offense, which I think is definitely a lot more... I think it's a lot more quarterback reliant. Like, there's a lot of decisions that you got to make pretty quickly as a passer there, compared to Palmer Ridge's, where there's a lot of RPOs. You could get away with running the ball really well and getting the defense out of position and making some simpler reads over there than you would at Vista Ridge. And so I think he could definitely, get in there and start his senior year and be really good for them. I really feel like that he can do that. He has a lot of experience over there. I mean, he's a very mature player. Time will tell, but I think he's a solid option to have there at the least. Now, whoever beats him out would have to be better than him, and I think you got to feel pretty good about that, because if you have someone who beats out a player like a Ben Noblet, I think you're pretty much set. You should feel pretty good about your team. But if you roll with Ben Noblet, then you're great as well. I think you could still win a lot of games with what you have there, with the line that they bring back, with some of the weapons that they have, with the coaching that they have. If you're Palmer Ridge, you feel relatively all right about this season. It'll be a little bit different. I don't know if they make a run at state like they did last year, but I mean, you have enough talent to win some games and still win this league, which I think is pretty important too as well. So let's go ahead and hop into it. I don't believe their schedule is set, so I'm just going to go with what I have as of today, the 21st. But to start, they play Ponderosa away. I think that's a loss. Ponderosa, they obviously lose some players as well, so I think really it should be relatively evenly matched, but it is away. It's the first game of the season, and Ponderosa, I mean, we know who their starting quarterback is, and it's Marcus Price, and I'm assuming he's healthy, and when Marcus Price was healthy, this Pondo team was dangerous. And Palmer Ridge, I mean, I assume they're going to commit to their quarterback, like, pretty quickly here, but whoever it is not going to have the experience that Marcus Price did last year. I mean, whoever they got is going to be a basically first-year varsity starter for them, and I just don't really love that for Palmer Ridge, who's going to have to play away. And also, low-key, this is a rivalry. Palmer Ridge, Ponderosa, they've played some tough games over the last couple years, some very competitive games. I think a lot of those competitive juices are going to be at work here, and I love Pondo at home. I think their crowd's going to come out for them, and that could be a real game changer. So I got to give it to Pondo, even though I think on paper this is relatively close. I think it's pretty much even. Then they play Doherty, that's a dub. They play Mesa Ridge. I think this could be close as well, but I mean, I just talked about Mesa Ridge. They have a lot of firepower, and honestly, I don't know if Palmer Ridge has the skill players defensively to match up with all of what they have over there. Now, we'll find out. If they beat him, then that's an obvious answer, but on paper, I do like Mesa Ridge a little bit more, but that's another close one. Then they play Air Academy, that's a dub. They play Durango following that, which unfortunately they have to make the trip down to Durango, which is always tough. I still think they're a better team than them, so they beat him. That's a very well-coached team down there, though, so you never know, but I just like what Palmer Ridge has going on here. Then they play Vista Ridge. I think that's a win. I just don't see Vista Ridge beating them with what all they're losing, so there you go. And then they play Liberty. That's another pretty easy win. Now, the one team that I did not include there that's not scheduled yet, but they will play because they're in their league, is Rampart. That's going to be low-key a tough game. I'm not going to lie. That's a game that they might lose, but I'm just looking at their schedule right now. I think if they schedule that game for that week of the 23rd, a week before that Ponderosa game, I don't think they're winning that game against Rampart. I just don't. I think that's too early. I haven't given the team enough time, I think, to really gel offensively, because I am really worried about the offensive production there. And I think that's a very winnable game for Rampart if they play them that week before. Now, any other week, though, I think they beat him. And so I think that's a dub for Palmer Ridge. But I would be very weary about that matchup. That's going to be a physical game. And honestly, it's a game that Rampart's probably hungry to win because they haven't been even close, really, to beating Palmer Ridge in seasons, in years. And I think they're going to be really motivated for that game to knock off Palmer Ridge and take control of the league, because that would be a very, very important league game there. It could go either way at that point. And I think even then, both teams could still make the playoffs. That could potentially mean the difference between a first-round bye and not a first-round bye. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Either way, though, here's what it comes down to. So I underestimated Palmer Ridge last season. I'm trying not to this season, right? I'm really not. But I do have the predicted record at 6-2. I'm sure they're going to add a couple games here. So my window for wins for them is actually 6-9 here, assuming they schedule 10 games eventually for them, just because I don't know. I mean, I feel like 6 games is the minimum. All the games that I had them winning are just games that I feel like they could really win. Maybe, actually, I'll make that window of wins 5-9, because I think maybe that Rampart game might not go their way if it's in August. I really feel like that matters, by the way. So, there's that. Other than that, they really should be close to 500, if not a couple games over, like they usually are. And honestly, I mean, Palmer Ridge has had a really good run with quarterbacks. I'm going to throw that out there. They have a great history. Derek Hester made it to state. Luke McAllister won it. Ty Evans won it. And McAllister and Ty Evans both went D1. You also had Isaiah Sanders before that, who had a great 2-year run over there. And so the last time Palmer Ridge hasn't had a good to great quarterback was 2013, over a decade ago. And that was also the last time they finished just at 500. After that, they've finished above 500 ever since. And I think that really does matter here. Whoever's at quarterback is going to be the X factor, and is going to be the difference between them making potentially another run here, or them being a playoff team who maybe gets bounced in the first or second round, honestly. And so we'll just have to see what happens. But either way, I mean, this is such a well-coached program, such a consistent program. They have a history of winning. That is what they do over there. And so even a down season for them is a winning season. And at worst, they go 500, make the playoffs, and they can make it a winning season from there, right? But, I mean, you just kind of got to believe in Palmer Ridge to figure it out, because they have so far in the past. I mean, they have pieces over there to work around. And I think that's definitely a green flag, but there's some work to be put in for sure. Other players are going to have to step up and play some good football here and have breakout seasons like a Jimmer Weir, like a TJ Mabe here coming up. So we'll just have to see what happens for Palmer Ridge, but you can't expect them to just have a losing season, the first one in 10 years. And if they do, then it's their first one in 10 years. All right, now the last team we're going to talk about here is Montrose, obviously the only non-Colorado Springs area team. Last year predicted them to go 10-0, undefeated, and gave them a window of wins of 8-10 here. I felt like it was a contending year for Montrose, and they were close, but they went 8-2 in the regular season, still within the window of wins here. Lost to Palmer Ridge, a tough one on the road to start, 28-27, and I think they were also leading at one point. And it's just very rare that Montrose gives up any sort of lead once they get one with the system they run. So that's kind of crazy, but they bounced back with a win over rival Fruita Monument 58-15. But then they had to, well, they hosted Erie, and they lost a tough one there, 38-28, another shootout here. As I mean, Blake Barnett kind of just went crazy in that game, to be honest with you, but dropped that one. Then they played Palisade and everyone else who they beat. I mean, they beat Palisade 42-0, Lutheran 36-14, Grand Junction Central 43-7, Falcon 56-22, Coronado 57-8, Mesa Ridge 43-12, and Pueblo West 33-7. And then they would make the playoffs as the third seed here. So they would have a bye, and they would play Pueblo West again, actually, which really, I feel like that does benefit them. But to play a team that you played like last in the regular season definitely makes it closer, and it resulted in a closer game as they only beat them 35-28 in kind of a close one there, but that would be enough to move them on to the next round, where they would face off with Windsor, who they took care of 26-7, before once more facing off with Erie, this time at Erie, where they just lost a tough one, 25-22, another heartbreaking loss to Erie. If you go back a couple of years, their season eerily ended the same way to Erie in the playoffs, in the semis again, 29-28, and I believe that was actually at Erie as well here, just falling short to them. And funny enough, that year as well, obviously Erie would go to the playoffs, they would go to state, which they would end up losing a close one to then Chatfield. But this time, Erie, I mean, they would be the eventual state champs. So, you know, they would lose to the eventual state champs, 25-22, which is actually closer than what Palmer Ridge lost to them by, who also, they only lost to Palmer Ridge by 1 point. So they lost to the two teams who made it to state. And I mean, this is taking Erie's last playoff matchup and that first Palmer Ridge game. They only lost to those two teams by a combined 4 points. Technically, I mean, they played Erie twice, so it would be a combined 14 points, as they lost by 10 to Erie earlier on in the same season. But still, I mean, they were a contender last year for sure, and they had a good season, but they just can't get over that hump. And I mean, teams know what they're going to be doing, and so that kind of contributes to that as well. But with that being said, that season is over. Let's talk about some of the players who contributed to that, starting with their star running back, Blake Griffin here. Ran for 1,519 yards, 28 rushing touchdowns as the workhorse for the squad. I believe those 28 touchdowns, most out of any 11-man football player in the state this last season. And if it's not the most, it's definitely a high mark, so there you go there. They also graduate their quarterback, Gage Wareham, who, I mean, admittedly, it's a run-first offense, but did a solid job, threw for 988 yards, 4 touchdowns to 3 picks on only 48 completions, which is not a lot, 48 completion percentage, which is not a lot there. But he also ran for 132 yards and 3 touchdowns, still contributing a solid amount. They also lose Austin Zimmer and Jackson Killen here. The seniors combined for over 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns total, assisting Griffin and Wareham. And they also had a combined 300 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns, so those are 2 other athletes that'll be tough losing. And then Killen was also their lead tackler with 113, and their sack leader with 6. So they lose some pretty big production on offense. On defense, they lose a good amount as well here. Jackson Killen leading the group with 113 tackles, which led the team. And they also graduate 9 of their top 13 tacklers, which also includes their top 7 tacklers. So this defense is also facing a pretty tough rebuild, same as the offense. But per usual, they do return some players, including Aiden Grivalha, I want to say. I assume that's how you say it. Excuse me if I'm saying that wrong. But he will be an incoming senior. And last year, he ran for 802 yards and 9 touchdowns in only 8 games, by the way. And so, assuming he could stay healthy, I think he's going to be the next guy in the backfield. And so, they're going to build around him. At least they have somebody who, was one of the main producers on this offense, which you got to feel good about. They also returned Cooper Ross, an incoming senior corner, 6'2", 165. One of the few returners on this defense. He had a solid year last year, 39 tackles, a couple of picks. I think he might get more involved on the offensive side of the ball as he is a pretty good athlete. So there you go there. And then on top of that, they return Andreas Distel, the 6'3", 275-pound center / nose guard, will be an incoming senior and should be a key part of this team once more. He led a very tough running offense, and so honestly, I mean, if you're going to return a lineman in your run-first offense, center is pretty important there. And then on defense, I think he should be able to contribute a pretty solid amount there. And so altogether, it's not as dominant on paper as the last couple years, but they return key players in key spots: running back, center, nose guard. They return a couple of tacklers in the secondary as well, so they could defend the pass. And so it's not the worst thing for Montrose. But let's get into the predictions. They play Durango to start the season, and I think this really benefits them. Durango, they're moving up from 3A. I think this is a prime game time to go ahead and catch Durango, because I assume they're eventually going to get used to the 4A competition and adjust and just get better as the year goes on. But I think catching them right at the beginning, that's a good spot to get them at. And I think that's a good spot to go ahead and play them. I think Montrose wins that game. It's also at home too, by the way. So there you go there. And that's saying something, as that is a solid team. Then they play Greeley West away, Palisade at home, Grand Junction Central at home, Freedom Monument away, and Falcon away. And I think those are all wins. That's a 5-game winning streak right there, to be honest with you. Then they play Doherty at home. Doherty, they got some size, so there could be some issues up front. Doherty has some defenders returning too, who I think theoretically can play this offense tough if they don't have other contributors over there. And on top of that, Doherty also has a quarterback who, he doesn't return his receivers, but he's going up against a secondary that's returning one corner. So I feel like that could potentially be, that's assuming Doherty receivers step up, that could potentially be a mismatch. I'm still giving it to Montrose though. But yeah, that's probably their toughest game in that stretch, next to Freedom Monument probably. Next to Freedom Monument. Falcon, they play there, and they have some players who plays the run extremely well, but I don't think they have the firepower. Then they play Mesa Ridge, and speaking of firepower, they have all of it. It's away as well, which is tough, I think, against a really good team in Mesa Ridge. I'm going to just play it safe and call that one a loss. But it could be pushed the other way too. Then they play Widefield, which is a dub, and Pueblo West at home. I think that's another dub. Pueblo West, if they played them earlier, that might even be a loss against an inexperienced defense, but I think right at the end of the season is also perfect for Montrose. Really good scheduling here for them. But altogether, predicted record for them, 9-1, with a window of wins between 7 and 10. Look, they're a consistent program, if anything, and despite losing some pieces, they returned the key pieces here in all the right spots: running back, center, defender, nose guard, right? And that's what matters. Montrose is always loaded with talent anyways, and the way they play offensive football, it works to their advantage for, a school that's out there, right? And it also helps that they don't have the toughest schedule. Freedom Monument, Mesa Ridge, Pueblo West, Doherty are probably their toughest games, but all of those are pretty much in the second half of the season. They get to play Durango, Greeley West, Palisade, and Grand Junction Central before they even face like a huge threat in probably Freedom Monument after that. And even then, I think they still beat them. And so With that being said, they're going to have some time to get better, to develop in-game and, form some chemistry there, which is going to be key. And I think the lack of their top-tier comp may make them soft, but I also think it could give them the confidence to go undefeated. Once they see that, hey, we're 5-0, 6-0, I think they could maybe just believe in that and keep it rolling, as they do have a winning culture over there. And so I'm very high on Montrose this year. I think they're going to make the playoffs for sure. There's no doubt about that. They're going to have a good shot at getting a top seed, getting a first round bye, all that great stuff here. And I mean, this is a team that consistently figures it out year by year. Defense is great. Offensively, I think they are a little bit limited by not being able to pass the ball on a consistent basis and on a more complicated basis. But, for now it works. I mean, this is a team that knows who they are. They're going to run the ball, control the clock, and play great defense. That's what they do. And at least they play great defense as well here. And, I mean, for the talent pool that they have, I think that's very appropriate, honestly. Not, like I said, not the biggest fan, but I'll give them a little bit of a pass, right? Just a little bit, though. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I do think if they want to get over that hump, they either have to have a bunch of great athletes who are just, once in a lifetime type athletes, or you got to get a really good quarterback, or a good quarterback in a good passing game. And we'll just have to see what happens from then on. I don't know. We'll see what happens here, but I do know that Montrose is going to have a winning season and be a dang good team come this fall. All right, that'll wrap up this episode. Stay tuned here in the next couple weeks. We're going to post Monday, Wednesday, Friday here, hopefully, to cover all 11-man football teams in the state of Colorado next week here. I'm looking at a good variety between, 5A, 4A, 2A, 3A, 1A competition. It's not just going to be 5A, 5A, and then 4A, and then 3A. I'm going to switch it up so that every week, you get, high classification teams, and then 1A, 2A classifications, some mid-tier classifications, 3A, 4A. And that way you have at least a little bit of some variety to start here. And so make sure you check them all out and follow us on social media at Playmakers Corner. That includes TikTok as well, where we are going to post highlights of some of these teams and just shorter summaries of all of these previews, as there are a lot of teams here in the state of Colorado, over 200, but we're the only media outlet that covers them, and we're looking forward to this season. But until next time, I'll catch you next week.